Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, a very good afternoon. It is Thursday. This is Drive. I'm Peter Cardwell, and there's loads to talk about. Farage, Nigel Farage, has broken his silence on Zelensky. He says he is not a dictator. We're also hearing today that more teenagers are on benefits for mental health than before COVID. I wonder why that is. Probably the lockdowns. Wealthy people ready to quit Britain over the huge taxation burden that Labour has brought in on them. We'll talk about that. And an asylum seeker declared a child by UK judges despite being 23 years old. He has a receding hairline and thick facial hair, but no, he's 16, according to these judges. It just shows yet again that we're being gaslit by these people. They're telling us black is white, and it simply is not. We'll talk about Israel as well. Horrendous scenes there where children, babies, have been given back to Israel. They were taken as hostages and murdered by Hamas terrorists in and around the 7th of October. We don't know exactly when. The president of Israel says our hearts lie in tatters. We'll talk as well about the fact that the BBC is going to be grilled over a Gaza documentary. Yesterday we talked about this. They put out a pretty snippy statement about it. Today they've done a complete 180 and they've said, oh yeah, by the way, actually the narrator of that documentary about life in Gaza is actually the son of a senior Hamas terrorist official. Who'd have thought? And yesterday they had full editorial control. Today they are throwing the independent documentary maker under a bus. There is a shock move there as well. We'll talk about all of that. Also, left-wing activists are less likely to work with political rivals than any other UK group. There's about 8% of people who are, I'm surprised it's so low actually, who are the really hardcore left-wing activists. They think, of course, that everybody thinks that refugees coming to our shores is a marvellous thing and that everyone's really left-wing. Guess what? They're not. Bit of a reality check for them. Let me know your thoughts on any of the issues we're talking about this Thursday drive time. 0344 499 1000 is the number to call. You can text me 87222 with the word talk in your text. You can tweet me at talkTV or follow me at Peter Cardwell on X or Twitter, as most people call it. You can also send me a voice note or a WhatsApp text message, or you can give me a ring for a live discussion on the air. That's what I like doing the most. We'll put as many of those on the air as we can between now and 7 o'clock. That main number, 0344 499 1000. Let's get started here on Talk Drive. Well, an awful lot of people are wondering and have been wondering what Nigel Farage thinks of the furore this week about Zelensky, especially the fact that Donald Trump has called Zelensky a dictator. My question is, if Zelensky's a dictator, what on earth is Putin? Well, lots of views on this. Lots of people who have previously supported Trump, a lot of people who have been big fans of Trump and have been to rallies and have been supporting him perhaps from this side of the Atlantic, who are in disagreement with him. There's a lot more to talk about as well with Isabel Oakeshott, who's Talk's international editor, who joins me now. Isabel, let's start with Farage. What's he said, and more to the point, why do you think he said it?
Well, what he said is, I think one of the most important things he said is that you should always take Trump seriously, but don't take him literally. And I think that's a really important point because, you know, we all know that Donald Trump speaks in some hyperbole. You know, he doesn't pick his words like a lawyer. He doesn't pick his words actually like a professional politician. And it is one of the reasons I think that people like him. You know, one of the reasons that he enjoys such massive support in the US is because he speaks in language that ordinary people can understand and he doesn't mince his words. But this was a difficult situation, I think, for Nigel Farage. He had to come out and say something. And, you know, he has to choose his words carefully because we're not in America. And any kind of indication of a split between Farage and his close American ally will, of course, be pounced upon. But what Nigel always does is be true to himself. And I think he's tried to express how he really feels without sort of causing any kind of diplomatic problem. So what he said is that he doesn't believe that Zelensky's a dictator, that he does think that there should be elections there at some point soon. And, you know, don't take Trump too literally, but do take him seriously. And I think, you know, any criticism about the length of time it took for him to come out with a comment really is misplaced. For a start, Mr. Farage was on a flight, a long-haul flight, at the time all this was breaking. But secondly, serious political parties don't just mouth off. They really have to consider their position before putting out statements on issues as tremendously delicate and complex as this one.
It is a tremendously delicate situation, and we know as well that Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron are going to be speaking to Trump very, very soon. It was actually Starmer himself who said that he wanted to be a bridge between Western European nations and Donald Trump. Do you think that actually Nigel Farage might have something to do with that role, given his closeness to the Trump administration?
Well, I'm not sure who would want that role in something as complex and difficult as this one. I mean, I think the idea that Starmer could be a bridge is just, frankly, completely fantastical. I mean, it's just not going to happen, is it? You might fancy the role, but he's not taken seriously by the Trump administration.
Is Peter Mandelson, though? That's my question. The new ambassador to the United States from the UK.
Well, we don't know how that's going to play out. But in terms of the contribution that Farage can make, he's always made it clear that he would, always try to be helpful in the interests of the UK. So, it's not an easy one, this, is it? It's absolutely fraught with political difficulties. For reform, the great peril here is that there are an awful lot of people who are and have long been absolutely desperate to characterize reform as pro-Russian. It is all complete and utter nonsense. But anything, a word out of place will merely play into the hands of those people with their fantasies and fake claims.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you speak about those people, because we had Sir Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, who said that he expected that were a vote to come to Parliament, that the majority of parties, if not all parties, would vote for UK troops to be sent to Ukraine as peacekeepers, apart from what he described as Trump bootlickers in Reform UK. He can't exactly make that criticism now, given that there is, even though it's very diplomatically expressed, nonetheless clear blue water between Nigel Farage and Donald Trump on this particular issue.
Yeah, I mean, and Nigel Farage has already shown that he's nobody's bootlicker. He has shown that his party cannot be bought. He showed that with standing up to Elon Musk. So, the one thing about Nigel, you might not always agree with him, but he does say it as it is, as he sees it. He's not in that sense, he's rather like Trump. He doesn't just try to choose the form of words he hopes and he thinks an audience wants to hear. He will say what he really thinks. And I think that is what he's done in this instance. But the whole thing about a vote in the Commons is a complete and utter nonsense. It's not, I'd be astonished if it happened, because there's not going to be anything to vote on. We're not going to be part of any kind of peacekeeping mission there. I can't see how that happens, because there is no structure within which to do that. It could only be under a NATO command, and we all know what that would trigger with Putin.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, we've had people like Olaf Scholz, for example, the Chancellor of Germany, saying we're just getting far too far ahead of ourselves in a lot of this. I wonder if I could ask you about the comments of Nigel Farage about something else. This is the fact that twice as many teenagers are now receiving disability benefits for mental health conditions than before the pandemic. This is 16 to 19-year-olds with mental or behavioural disorders. That number has risen sharply. And in December 2019, just prior to the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns, it should be said, the number of young people receiving personal independence payments, that's £184.30 a week. This is people over the age of 16 with long-term physical or mental health conditions that impairs their mobility or daily living tasks. Well, it was about 74,500 before the lockdowns. Now it's 147,370. And Farage has said, what I see is we sort of disincentivise young people, and to think that another 1 million young people since the start of the pandemic are on disability benefits because they're suffering from depression and the doctors sign them off, we need some very, very big cultural changes. His specific words we may not take him literally, but I think we can take him seriously perhaps on that one, because there is a very serious point here.
Well, I don't really want to talk about Nigel Farage in this relation because it's so much more of an important issue than what one party leader thinks about it. I have really strong views on this. You know, lockdowns did monstrous harm to a generation of young people. And we now see the price that many of these young people are paying. And it was so obvious, wasn't it? You know, if you lock people up for months on end, particularly in the depths of winter, and those people that are not fortunate enough to have big gardens or access to nice outdoor space, it's going to have devastating effect. And it did. You know, people literally died. There were children who died as a result of lockdown because they were locked inside with abusive, murderous parents. That is just a fact. But equally, I don't think lockdown should be used as an excuse to abandon this generation and just write them off and put them on disability or PIP benefits for the rest of their lives. That would be just doubling the tragedy, wouldn't it? Because, you know, to be written off in your teens or your 20s, it's an appalling thing, you know. And if you can't begin to build a life outside benefits in those at that point in your life, then it's really going to be much harder to pick it up again later. I think equally we've really created a very overly permissive attitude towards claims of mental health, and whilst many of them are genuine, an awful lot of them aren't really what we should be paying benefits for, and people need other help and perhaps a bit of robust encouragement to be getting into the world of work, which would be good for them.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, you know, I'm someone who has suffered from mental health problems from time to time, and work is a good thing. Gives you lots of, I mean, when I can come to work, as I do 99% of the time, it's a marvellous thing. Gives you structure, gives you purpose, gives you human interaction. There is something of the dignity of work to talk about what Rishi Sunak often says, believe it or not. I want to talk to you.
Make an important point, Peter, there, because you said what it does for you, but what about what you can do for others? You know, we enjoy listening to you.
Oh.
And equally, people who have mental health problems but manage to do a job that benefits others, then that's a double good, isn't it?
It is certainly, and it's certainly something worth thinking about, the dignity of work, and also just the point of it as well. There is a point of it by itself. I just want to talk about something else. There's so many really interesting stories around today. There's an asylum seeker who has been declared a child by UK judges. I mean, he's, as far as I can make out, factually not a child, given that he's 23. He has a receding hairline and thick facial hair. I mean, this is just mad. We're being told black is white here.
Every week. I mean, nearly every day at the moment. I don't know what it is with our judges at the moment. I mean, we haven't had so many of these. But we're not allowed to criticise them.
We're not allowed to criticise them, Isabel, because the Lady Chief Justice says that we're not allowed to criticise judges, and Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer shouldn't have criticised them because obviously judges can do no wrong. I know you agree with that.
It's an absolute red rag to a bull, isn't it, to say that we can't criticise them. They're not above our judgment, you know, and they should just...
and they're human. They make mistakes.
They do make mistakes, but what worries me is that they don't think these are mistakes. You know, that no one's admitting they're a mistake. They appear to be very politically driven interpretations being put on the law. And I just don't know how much more of this voters will swallow. You know, at some point, either you change the judges or you change the laws. We're going to have to do one or other of those things, I feel. It's
a very salient point. Isabel, thank you. This is Isabel Oakeshott there, who's Talk's international editor. Thanks to everybody who's been in touch as well. Cliff in Berkshire says, here's my assessment of the situation in Ukraine. The EU encouraged Zelensky to antagonise Russia, and to some degree that's what he reacted to. Many people in eastern Ukraine speak only Russian and see themselves as Russian. Ukraine is a very corrupt country, and many felt better under Russia than the mediocre comedian, says Cliff in Berkshire. Sue says, there's nothing wrong with calling Zelensky a dictator. Our own government is a dictatorship. Reg says, isn't David Lammy the foreign secretary? Shouldn't he be speaking to Trump? I mean, Trump's been through enough. Maybe he's busy watching Celebrity Mastermind with David Lammy, which I hugely recommend you do. Lorraine has been in touch on the Israel hostages, and she says the government's silence on today's events in Israel is deafening. The sight of the convoy carrying the tiny bodies of the Bibas children, their mother and an 84-year-old peace activist, activist is more than heartbreaking. These innocents were butchered by Hamas terrorists, the evil terrorist organisation that is here in Britain. The BBC can't bring itself to condone, and masses march for such hatred through our streets with no consequences. Lammy and Starmer should hang their heads in utter shame for refunding UNRWA, some of whom were actively involved in the massacre, torture and hostage taking. Lorraine, I agree with every word of that, especially when you're talking about UNRWA, which is the UN refugee agency. That there was a day a couple of weeks ago, I promise you this happened. What happened was the government said there's £17 million of funding for maths, teaching maths in school. We're going to cut that funding. On the same day, they announced £17 million for UNRWA, which is this UN agency that operates in Gaza. And we know for sure that UNRWA is riddled with Hamas terrorists. We know that UNRWA facilities, UN facilities that this government has paid £17 million for, has just announced more funding. We funded it over a long period of time. Well, those were used to hold some of the totally innocent Israeli hostages. We're going to talk about this throughout the programme. We're going to get a range of voices. Nicole Lampert will be coming up a little bit later on. Stay with us here on Talk.
There's a lot out around at the moment. You're Starmer talking about troop numbers. He will what troop numbers would be needed for different scenarios, because the J5 plans branch at strategic headquarters in our joint force headquarters will be planning different options and refining them as political direction comes in. Trump will almost certainly have told Starmer, go to Europe and tell them that you're going to take a lead, and therefore that's why Starmer will have done it, and Trump will have done that knowing Europe will fall apart. I've planned these sorts of operations. I've done it twice.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
So everybody knows that Rachel Reeves has been in trouble because of her CV and claiming, as she did, that she spent, as she put it, the best part of a decade at the Bank of England. Well, it was actually 5.5 years. How long did she actually work for HBOS, Halifax Bank of Scotland? What did she do there? This very withering put down, this very withering nickname, Rachel from accounts or Rachel from customer services, has come up, and you know, that's been something that has been thrown at her. Some people say misogynistically, others people say it's just a nickname. So there's a lot going on here, and now we have the business secretary, one of her cabinet colleagues, a man called Jonathan Reynolds, you know, the one with the beard, who has claimed that he is a fully qualified solicitor in various election, information, literature, propaganda, whatever you want to call it. And actually, we know that not only did that happen, but a professional body told him to stop claiming he was a solicitor. This is something called the Solicitors Regulation Authority, which protects the public from bogus authorities, sent a letter to Mr. Reynolds in January, And we're told by Labour that the Cabinet Minister immediately corrected what was put as an inadvertent error, even though he made it a number of times. So he inadvertently made it a number of times. But essentially, he's been told to stop claiming he's a solicitor and on a CV by the Lawyers Watchdog. So that's a very interesting development in that. And also, at the same time, one of these big finance chiefs of one of the biggest companies in Britain, a FTSE 250 company, so the 250 biggest public companies in this country, one of them is called the company is called the John Wood Group, and Arvind Balan resigned last night following what was described as the incorrect description of his professional qualifications in various statements in the public domain. He had called himself a chartered accountant, and if you're a chartered accountant, that is a specific thing, when actually he's just an accountant. He's a certified practicing accountant, and he said, "It was an honest oversight. My decision is based on minimising distraction at this very pivotal time with our investors and lenders." So let's talk now to Ronnie Fox, who is an employment lawyer. Ronnie, thank you for joining us this afternoon. How important is it that you are the difference between a trainee solicitor and a solicitor, that is made very clear, Ronnie, that is what the difference actually is?
Hugely important. A lawyer must not deceive anybody, least of all prospective clients. And I think the position of Mr. Reynolds has become unsustainable.
So you think he should resign because of this?
Absolutely. He must realise that what he did was not just an error, but really, really wrong and misleading. And if he doesn't want to resign, the leader, our Prime Minister, should make him resign.
Yeah, it's interesting because he says, look, it was on LinkedIn. It wasn't something that he said himself. He was, although he had said it in Parliament actually a couple of times in regard to his own position. He'd put it on election literature and so on. I mean, there is a very big difference between a trainee solicitor and a solicitor. A lot of people who are trainee solicitors don't become solicitors. And similarly, when you're thinking about this other sort of captain of industry, this person who said he was a chartered accountant, I mean, that is very different from being a sort of straightforward bog standard accountant, isn't it?
It is very different. As it so happens, I have a daughter who's a chartered accountant and a son-in-law who's a certified accountant, and they're different.
A lot of people might not know the difference. Can you just briefly explain what the difference is?
They're two different organisations. The Institute of Chartered Accountants admits members as chartered accountants through one process. Certified accountants have their own professional body and they're admitted through a different process. But that is, to my mind, a much more pardonable error than describing yourself as a solicitor when you're not. Because if he learned anything at all when he was a trainee solicitor, he must have learnt about the importance of the word solicitor and not to use it unless you are a solicitor.
And that accuracy is very important. I wonder more generally, not just in the legal profession, but in society itself, how these descriptions are incredibly important. I mean, we're hearing, I don't want to ask you a political opinion necessarily, but I mean, we're hearing that Donald Trump should be taken seriously, but not literally in everything that he says. People talk about it being a sort of post-truth age. I wonder how important it is to describe yourself accurately.
Well, to my mind, not lying is quite important in every aspect of life, but especially if you have control over other people's money and other people's destiny, as you do when you're a Minister of the Crown.
And that is something that Keir Starmer is dealing with. I mean, how big a problem is it in the legal profession, Ronnie? You're an employment lawyer, and just employment in general, for people telling porky pies, and actually, of course, that can have a big effect on what they can and can't do, and if you do a bit of work for someone, how valid that work actually is.
To my mind, it's very, very important. I don't really understand why the Solicitors Regulation Authority has decided not to take any action beyond requiring the change in the LinkedIn profile of Mr. Reynolds. It is very, very important that people describe themselves accurately, and there may be a bit of wiggle room for politicians. I've been told that you shouldn't become a politician unless you're prepared to lie from time to time, which is a somewhat cynical attitude. But describing yourself as a solicitor is just beyond the pale.
From your employment lawyer perspective, not just as a solicitor yourself, but also from the employment aspect of that, I wonder, how often have you come up against people lying in CVs?
Not very often. It's quite unusual. But if a firm of solicitors were to employ somebody who described themselves as a solicitor, they would normally check it by asking to see a practicing certificate or by checking online, because the names of all solicitors with a practicing certificate are publicly available online. There's a register and it's easy to check. And any law firm employing another lawyer as a solicitor would check it. But of course, that doesn't apply in a political world where people give their backgrounds as part of an effort to secure recognition as an important politician.
And it's often only when they get to the top, to the cabinet level, that people really properly check these things. Very interesting talking to you. Thank you. That's Ronnie Fox there, who's an employment lawyer. Appreciate him joining me on the programme today. Jane says the only reason Reeves and Reynolds are still in their jobs is because they're Labour MPs. If they were Tories, they would have long gone, because it would have been rolling news until they did. Well, we know that, for example, that Boris Johnson told lies in his CV. He got sacked, actually, for doing things he shouldn't be doing from various newspapers and other publications. So he became Prime Minister. So does it matter? Does it matter if people lie on their CV? Let me know your thoughts. 0344 499 1000. Thank you to Gary. He says, here goes Oakshot again on our lockdown hobby horse. The truth is that most countries have similar lockdowns to the UK, and how many of these are experiencing the same issues with mental health among 16 to 19-year-olds as we are. I haven't heard of any. It's just that where the benefit system is overly generous and easy to hoodwink. And Brittany from the USA says, I agree with Errol Morrick when it comes to Trump. Actually, on Trump, Peter has given me a ring from Croydon. You can do the same thing, 0344 499 1000, whether you're in Croydon or not. Peter, I think it's Trump that you want to talk about, but specifically the Middle East.
Yes. We all know that Trump's soft on kids. And I think he's obviously respecting Israel in the peace process, but he's wanting to go after Hamas. And I think now, they're going to make the deal, but all hostages have to be returned, and after that, they're just going to go after Hamas, aren't they?
Yeah, we're talking about that later today, and some of the scenes today have just been particularly heartrending. I mean, the bodies that have been given back. We know, I mean, just this family, the Bibas family, Shiri Bibas and her two young sons, Ariel and Kafir, were then 4 years old and 9 months old, were taken hostage during the 7th of October Hamas terrorist attacks in 2023. The father, Yarden, he was abducted separately. Shiri Bibas, the mother, and her two young sons were murdered by Hamas terrorists when in captivity. They say, or their propaganda is, that an Israeli strike killed them. I mean, if they weren't in Hamas...
well, they shouldn't have taken them.
Well, they shouldn't have thank you very much. They shouldn't have taken them in the first place. Yarden Bibas was released alive on the 1st of February along with 2 other hostages, but Hamas, Shiri's parents actually, Jose Luis, Yossi Silberman and his wife Margaret Silberman were also killed, were also murdered on the 7th of October. I mean, the family has just been through so much, and we haven't heard a word yet from our political leaders about what has happened today.
No, I mean, this morning I saw, I obviously didn't see it, but heard about it. I know I was just sick to my stomach, you know, and and basically I think let 3 days of mourning or so, and then after that make a decision, agree to what Hamas is saying, get all the hostages back, and stick the 2 fingers up to Hamas and say, look, we're not playing your games anymore, we're coming after you.
Peter, thanks for your thoughts. We're going to talk about this a little bit later in the programme as well. I'm also struck by what Simon Harris, the Prime Minister of Ireland, has said. The parading of caskets of young children by Hamas today was cruel, heartbreaking and utterly despicable. It is a stark reminder of the brutality of October the 7th. We must see an enduring peace in the Middle East where neither terrorism nor bombing of innocent civilians is tolerated. I mean, why can't you just talk about what happened today without talking about Israel all the time, because that's what Ireland does all the time. It is the most pro-Palestinian, or one of the most pro-Palestinian countries in the world, and they can't just talk about Hamas terrorists being bad people. They never, ever do it, and it drives me mad. Lots of people getting in touch about people lying in their CVs. Andrew says, wonder what would happen if I lie about being a certified gas installer and then a house blows up. Very good point, Andrew. I had an electrician in my flat today putting in my heated mirror. Yes, I really am that middle class. And yeah, he would need to know how to wire it up, and indeed he did. He did a very good job. Paul from Hertfordshire, imagine if a person was saying he was a doctor but never qualified as a doctor. How would that look? It's a terrible example, and look, we should tell our kids, is it okay to do this? Terrible, terrible example set by a bunch of charlatans. Lots more to discuss on this. Make sure you get your call in, 0344 499 1000, and we're going to talk about Israel. We're also going to talk about the BBC doing a complete 180, a complete volte-face on what they said. They gave us a statement yesterday. Today they're basically distancing themselves from the statement. This is on a big documentary they did. Guess who was narrating it? The son of a Hamas terrorist. Yes, really. BBC said, oh, we had full editorial control. Today they've changed their tune. Surprise, surprise. Stay with us here on Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
It's been called Israel's saddest day. This is the President of Israel saying our hearts lie in tatters, because what has happened is that coffins containing the remains of 4 hostages, including a baby, are returned from Gaza. They've been returned from Hamas terrorists. It is just absolutely grim. The President of Israel, Isaac Herzog, has says, agony, pain, there are no words. Our hearts, the hearts of an entire nation, lie in tatters. On behalf of the State of Israel, I bow my head and ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness for not protecting you on that terrible day. Forgiveness for not bringing you home safely. May their memory be a blessing. He's referring, of course, to the horrendous Hamas terrorist attacks on the 7th of October. And there's still people, 504 days, I think. Yes, because Monday was the horrific anniversary. 503 days that they have been held by Hamas terrorists. There are around 50 people still being held, and we know that some of them have been released as part of a deal. Some of them haven't. Some of them are still there. Some of them are being tortured. Some of them are being just treated absolutely horrendously. And over all of this as well, we'll get the details on what happened today, is the BBC. The BBC did a documentary about life in Gaza, and guess who was narrating it? The son of a Hamas terrorist. I mean, you couldn't make it up. Now the Culture Secretary is going to ask them about it. I'm sure they're quicking their boots for Lisa Nandy's questions around that. Let's talk to Nicole Lambert, who's a freelance journalist who knows about all this. Nicole, what a dreadful day. I mean, there have been some really flipping bad days in Israel's history, and the 7th of October was one of them. But just today, seeing those coffins, and particularly the way those coffins were treated by Hamas terrorists. The fact that people were bringing children out to, in Gaza to see these coffins go past as if it was some sort of festival. It's absolutely sickening.
It is. It was such a, I don't know, I'm going to try and keep it together. I just feel like I've been crying all day, really. And certainly lots of people in the Jewish community in this country and in Israel feel incredibly emotional. These babies, these children kind of felt like all of our babies. I think because they have distinctive kind of very red hair, they really stuck out, and they, as all babies are, they're adorable and cute. And we saw the footage of their mother being taken from her home in Israel with the two babies wrapped in her arms. That was the last time we saw of her, apart from there was footage of her being taken inside Gaza. So we know that she was alive when she reached Gaza, and then she disappeared. More than a year ago, all the other children were exchanged for prisoners, but those two remained with their mother, and their father was released a few days ago to find out that his family had disappeared. And today, although we're still waiting for confirmation, it appears that those three have returned. And the fourth body belongs to Oded Lifshitz, whose daughter is British, and I'm sure she's been on talkTV. She's been all over the place speaking about her father. He was an amazing peace activist. He was a journalist, and he would drive up to the Gaza border, pick up patients that needed to go to hospital, and take them to hospital, wait with them all day, and then take them back to Gaza. And this is what's happened. And what happened this morning was abhorrent. It showed us exactly what Hamas are. They are monsters.
Jeremy Corbyn used to be the leader of the opposition in this country. At one stage he said the idea that an organisation, Hamas, that is dedicated towards the good of the Palestinian people and long-term peace and social justice and political justice in the whole region should be labelled as a terrorist organisation by the British government is really a big mistake. I would ask him today, Mr. Corbyn, what planet are you on? This is so incredibly clear that this organisation are horrendous. We're talking about a 9-month-old baby and a 4-year-old child. What have they done? There are so many people, and you've mentioned a number of them, Nicole, who had nothing to do with this. They had nothing to do with the Israeli government. They had nothing to do with anything that anybody says is bad or has been visited on the Gazan people. Often peace activists, often people who live in kibbutzes, which are the most, hold hands and worship the rainbow kind of places I've ever been. It is just awful what has happened. Nobody deserves this, no matter what your outlook is. Nobody deserves what has happened. And in a horrible, horrible way, Nicole, and I wish today had never happened, but we almost need it to remind ourselves once again of just the horror that has been visited on people over the last 18 months or so.
I agree, because I think over the last few weeks we've really seen what Hamas are, and the fact that they revelled in it. And I don't like to make comparisons with the Nazis, but I suppose this is recent Jewish history and people do. And the Nazis, they were monsters, obviously, complete monsters who murdered 6 million Jews. They try to hide what they did, whereas Hamas revels in it. From October 7th, we saw that they were videoing what they did. They put it on social media. They even as they were killing people, they opened up the Facebook pages of the people they were killing to show their family members. They absolutely reveled in it, and they reveled in it today. I think people thought, perhaps, okay, they've let out emaciated men, they've let out young women, but returning the bodies of babies, surely they will show some sort of humanity. But no, they made it into a spectacle. They had young children there, they had people smoking hookah pipes, they had music, they had drums, they had placards, which were very similar to the ones we've seen on our marching up and down our streets, and they absolutely enjoyed it. And I hope that the British public, wherever they stand on this, and whether they think that of course, that whether they want there to be a Palestinian or state, I hope they see that these are monsters that you cannot deal with, and you cannot live next door to, and much full of hatred they are.
A viewer actually sent me a tweet today from someone called Hillel Fould, who I haven't come across before, who showed pictures of the seating that had been put out for various senior Hamas men to sit and watch this. There were people along the road bringing their children out as if this was a festival. And Hillel Fould has written, "Do you believe in Satan? I didn't till this morning. They brought babies to watch other babies in body bags. There is no limit to their depravity." It's really sorry, Nicole.
I was just going to say, I mean, Hillel's story is really interesting. I interviewed him a few weeks ago. His brother Ari was actually killed by a Palestinian terrorist, and he's going to be let out in the next, probably on Saturday, one of 600 that's being exchanged for these 4 dead bodies. There's another 6 dead bodies to come, and I think, and then 6 people that are going to be let out alive on Saturday. So Hillel has a particularly sad story, and he's written about how his brother's life has given a life. But that's the strange situation that we're in, that the bodies of dead babies are being used to barter for prisoners.
For prisoners who have committed heinous crimes, who have done the kinds of things that happened on the 7th of October on previous occasions. I just want to talk about how the media sees this, because we have, you actually tweeted, I think, earlier today about, I'm just looking up your tweet here, and you said, I genuinely feel sickened by the fact the BBC is literally parroting Hamas propaganda, fresh after using Hamas royalty as a narrator for a quote-unquote documentary. And this is a headline that says, on a story as well, that says, Hamas said it did everything in its power to keep hostages alive. I mean, that is just absolute nonsense.
Yeah, what I don't, like, in what world is the BBC think that's a good idea? Particularly, there's a huge amount of fuss about the documentary that you've mentioned, where they had they followed 4 children. One of them, the narrator of it, it turns out is the son of somebody who's quite senior in Hamas and whose grandfather helped found Hamas. So he is Hamas royalty, and this is who they have narrating. And for 2 days, we've had the BBC backtracking, and at first they said they had full editorial control.
Well, let me actually read out, let me just interrupt you there and illustrate this 180 with the statements. I read this out yesterday on the programme, because we covered the story yesterday in the programme. Should say, by the way, Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone got a 5-star review, by the newspaper reviewer for which paper? The Guardian. BBC spokesman said, Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone. This was yesterday, so they've done a complete 180 from this. How to Survive a War Zone, a documentary showing the conflict through the eyes of 3 children in Gaza, was produced in line with BBC editorial guidelines, and the BBC, this is absolutely crucial, had full editorial control. The film told the children's own stories, showing viewers their direct experiences of living through a war, and the children's parents did not have any editorial input. As the BBC has previously explained, the film was edited and directed from London, as independent international journalists are not allowed into Gaza. The film gives audiences a rare glimpse of Gaza during the war, as well as an insight into the children's lives, and hears from the voices of other Gazan civilians, several of whom voice anti-Hamas sentiments. That was yesterday. This is today. The apology came, saying that it had not been informed of the connection by the documentary's producers before it was broadcast. Why didn't you just tell us that yesterday? We followed all of our usual compliance procedures. This is statement number 2, contradicting statement number 1. BBC says, we followed all our usual compliance procedures in the making of this film, but we had not been informed of this information by the independent producers when we compiled the then broadcast the finished film. Well, if you had full editorial control, how did you not know? The two do not match up. Someone is not giving the full story here, and I'm not convinced we have the full story. And Danny Cohen, actually, is the former controller of BBC Television, says the corporation failed to do basic journalistic checks. He says the serious questions asked of the BBC remain unanswered. Why did our national broadcaster fail to carry out the basic journalistic checks needed to ensure that propaganda from the terrorists of Hamas was not broadcast in prime time? It's a fair question.
Exactly, and there are many more questions, and one of the ones I really want answered is, was this boy paid? Did our money go into the pockets of Hamas terrorists?
Or independent, I'm doing air quotes here for people who are listening to the radio, independent journalists in Gaza who often are not anything like independent journalists anywhere else in the world. I think it's a mistake of the Israeli government not to allow people into Gaza, not to allow journalists into Gaza, but nonetheless, if there is propaganda coming from Hamas, let's just call it what it is.
Yeah, there's always been propaganda coming out from Hamas. That's all that's coming out of Gaza. And you know, actually at this point, I agree with you. They should let journalists in. I can understand why they aren't. But, you know, as a journalist, I think I can understand why there's frustration. But we can see from this documentary, like, how independent are independent journalists? You know, how neutral are they when the BBC is backtracking and backwards and forwards? For me, it feels like the BBC is in crisis here. And
I don't think they know what's going on. I don't think they know the full story. I think they're scrambling and they're putting out the first statement directly contradicts the second statement.
Yeah, and they just, you know, we've seen this before actually with various other problems that the BBC has had. They said one thing, they've had to actually do the investigation and come out with something else on many different topics. And it just feels like this is part of a wider problem that the BBC has. And one of them is, you know, accountability. And then the other one is this problem that basically they have a kind of pro-Palestine slant in the newsroom. And that is a problem. You know, whatever comes out of Gaza is there's censorship, and they never ever say that. Whereas when they were in Lebanon, when Israel was controlling parts of it, they said this is, you know, that we are being censored. They've never once said that about Gaza. Whereas,
or alternatively, you have people like Jeremy Bowen who tweet and talk about very brave independent journalists and so on. And I'm sure some of them are brave, but an awful lot of them are Hamas propagandists. Nicole, we'll talk more about this, no doubt. Thank you for your input today. Appreciate that. That's Nicole Lampert there, who's a freelance journalist. Bill in Romsey says, will the BBC now call Hamas a terrorist group? I wouldn't hold your breath, Bill. Rachel says the demonstration by Hamas today is the nearest thing to evil I've ever seen. Praying for all the remaining hostages and their brave families. Thank you, Rachel. That's a lovely message, even though it's about a horrible thing. Regarding the BBC Gaza documentary, Kim says, how much of our BBC licence payers' money did the BBC spend on this doc? I think perhaps a freedom of information request should go in on that one. Dawn in Chelmsford says the celebratory mood of Hamas and sinister men with guns just demonstrates that there will never be peace. The terrorists have got to be broken. Louise says these evil Hamas murderers couldn't even give those little children the decency of a correct size coffin and a peaceful handover. It is utterly revolting. Mark in Suffolk says, regarding the BBC, they knew exactly what they were doing. It's because they truly believe they are right. Their contempt for anything other than their far left view of the world is ignored. Amanda says the BBC never fail in their biased arrogance. My heart goes out to the decent, patriotic British Jewish people who have to suffer the blatant anti-Semitic reporting we see on the TV and the Hamas supporting marches we see on the streets. It is shameful. Lots of people getting in touch about that. Lots of people getting in touch about lying on your CV as well. We will talk about that. We'll talk about Trump and Farage and Zelensky and all the rest of it. And perhaps in this break, you can lift the phone, give us a call. We will take some calls after the break. The number, of course, 0344 499 1000.
is far too premature to be committing our troops. You know, I don't deal in hypotheticals when it comes to putting our people on the ground. We don't know what the terms of any peace deal will be. We don't even know if there will be a peace deal at this point. And imagine if it's a peace deal that actually gives Russia more territory than what they currently have, let alone the territory they're currently illegally holding. Are we really going to be willing to reinforce that, essentially suggesting that it's a just and fair peace? I'm really concerned because we know the Trump regime just want an end of fighting.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
Thank you to everyone who's been in touch, including T, who says, I'm at a loss to understand what they benefit for to hold on to dead hostages. These people are pure evil in plain sight. Angela says, the BBC said on the 8:30am News and Radio 1 this morning that Hamas said the hostages were killed by an Israeli bombing raid. It was second on their news, the first all about Man City. Well, yes, certainly, that is what Hamas say. These people, we don't know and we'll never know whether they were killed in an Israeli bombing raid by mistake, of course. But the fact is, why were they in Gaza in the first place? Because they were kidnapped, and we know that Hamas terrorists have murdered many, many other hostages, and I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest if they had murdered these children too. They've murdered many other children. That has happened. That is factual. We know that Israeli bombs have done the same thing in regard to killing children. We know that has happened. We know there are far too many innocent civilians who have been caught up in this conflict, and that is why it needs to end. And it could be ended today if Hamas gives back all of the hostages, and that is exactly what they should do. Right then, let's talk to Jill in Cornwall about this. Jill has given me a ring on 0344 499 1000. Jill, you're very welcome to the programme. What would you like to say?
Gosh, Peter, it's so difficult to stay calm in these situations, because I do feel that especially the BBC, probably more so the BBC, and I'm going to say it, they always make it appear as if Israel is the problem. Israel is the enemy. Israel started this trouble, and because of Israel, this and the rest of it. And I'm so angry with the fact that we're talking about a terrorist group here. Mm-hmm. We're talking about Hamas. They are terrorists.
Do you know what, Jill? Just on that exact point, a few years ago, I always sort of slightly joke, black humour, but I slightly joke that Hamas radicalised me, because before the 7th of October, I was slightly of the on the one hand, on the other. If you're on either side of this argument, you're part of the problem. All that kind of stuff. And then I just thought, actually, hold on a second. What the 7th of October has taught us is that there is, I'm not saying Israel's perfect, I'm not saying Netanyahu's perfect, I'm not saying the government's perfect or everything they've done is marvellous or wonderful. I'm not saying that for a second. But what I am saying is there's a democracy there that believes in things like rights for women and rights for, gay people and people who are a bit different for whatever reason. There are elections. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And then beside them, there are a group of people who, wouldn't allow you as a woman to have an opinion. Who throw gay people off buildings, people who, do what they did on the 7th of October and since. And I just think that there's a clear choice here. There is a choice to be made. It's a very straightforward choice.
Of course there is, and it's obvious, but for some reason or the other, whenever you see the BBC News or documentaries, there is a slant towards the fact that Israel is the problem, and for the life of me, I can't see it, and I don't think I'm upset with the fact that I pay a license fee to support a company that I do not believe in. It's like buying a pair of shoes that don't fit me. It is I do not agree with how they portray Israel to be. And yes, I didn't really have much of an opinion before the 7th of October. I read the news, listened to the news and all the rest of it. But from that date when what happened, I feel that I have a right to an opinion.
Of course.
And that opinion is such that Israel is not getting a fair. They're not getting a fair picture.
Yeah.
They're not. They're not.
Okay.
When it comes to the when it comes to the television programs that are in front of us. And
that we pay for. Well, Jill, listen, thank you for your thoughts on that. I appreciate those. Jill in Cornwall. Scott is in Essex and has a view on this situation too. Scott, you're very welcome to the programme. What would you like to say?
Hi, Pete.
Hi there.
There's 2 points on this, and I don't think people are sort of realising the long-term scale of what's going to be happening.
Oh, I think we've just... you went out there for a second. Just repeat that point, Scott, please.
It was just someone's point of view was earlier about why the Israels are so happy to get even, unfortunately, their passed away children returned to them. Because it's closure. They are...
It's understandable, isn't it?
People
totally understandable.
So much to their own people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Hamas is basically couldn't really care less, and they're not really humanitarians in any shapes or
quite the opposite. Quite the opposite.
Now, to them, they are getting hundreds of murderers back, terrorist murderers. You could call them the scum of the earth and everything else, and I think you wouldn't even scratch the surface of how these people should be referred to. And they're only giving 1 or 2 hostages back at a time. That's the value that the Israeli people put on their own people. They are that much valuable, they will pay anything to get them back.
Yeah.
Hamas knows this. That's the reason why they're only giving 1 or 2 back at a time. And as soon as they run out, it's not going to be a case of ticker-tape parades and peace in the Middle East. No. Hamas is going to go on a shopping list, and they're going to get another group of hostages.
Well, I hope that doesn't. I hope that doesn't happen. But I know exactly. I can see your point on this, Scott, and I do wonder what happens next and whether there can be peace there, because it's just such an incredibly difficult situation. Scott, thanks for your thoughts. I appreciate that. Another person has been in touch on text, says absolutely heartbreaking footage to watch evil Hamas terrorists. The poor father of that family, my heart goes out to him. How can he carry on? Ben says, I abhor anyone who supports Hamas. They really are the enemy, says Ben. Lots to think about this, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later on in the programme as well. So do keep your opinions coming in. 0344 499 1000 is the number. We're going to talk about more teenagers on benefits for mental health than before COVID, and what the effects really of the COVID lockdowns have been on not just the economy but the mental health of our nation as well. Jamie Jenkins is going to be with us. He's a political and economic commentator. We'll talk to him, but I want to talk to you as well in the next hour, because there's lots to talk about, including about Zelensky, Farage, Starmer, and a third of small businesses planning to cut staff amid fears of Labour's overhaul of workers' rights. That's going to kick in just over a month's time at the start of the new financial year. So if you're a small business and you have some thoughts on this, on headcount, on national insurance rises, I'd love to hear from you. 0344 499 1000.
Across the UK. On DAB+. On YouTube. On your mobile. And on your side. This is Talk.
Good evening, this is Talk Drive. I'm Peter Cardwell. Thank you very much for your company. There's lots to talk about. We're talking about all sorts of things, including more teenagers on benefits for mental health than before COVID. Why is that? Well, we know the lockdowns have a role to play. Farage says Zelensky is not a dictator, putting him on a collision course, or at least saying something slightly different to what Donald Trump is saying. We know that Trump's Ukraine envoy is to meet Zelensky in Kyiv amid the growing rift. We're talking about Israel as well. Heartbreaking, horrendous scenes from their Hamas terrorists celebrating, essentially, well, they are celebrating, that the bodies of babies and a 4-year-old have been given back, and the BBC under fire about a Gaza documentary. Guess who narrated it? The son of a Hamas terrorist. Yes, really. And then they flip-flopped over their statements on it in a classic bit of terrible communications from them. We'll talk all about that. We'll make sure you get your voice on the air. 0344 499 1000 is the number to call. You can text me 87222 with the word talk in your text. You can tweet me at talkTV and follow me at Peter Cardwell. You can also send me a voice note. You can send me a WhatsApp text message or give me a ring for a discussion live on the air. 0344 499 1000. Stay with me here on Talk Drive. Jonathan Reynolds' CV, he's the business secretary. That's another one that's exercising you today. He said he was a solicitor. He wasn't. Labour says, oh, it's not that bad, really. Well, a lot of people disagree with that. Let's take a couple of voice notes now to start the hour. Sam, first of all, on the BBC documentary. This is the Gaza documentary.
The BBC always do this. Each time this type of thing happens, they always put it out knowing that it's very biased, very one-sided and very inappropriate in some cases, and then they say, oh, that's all right, if it's called out we'll just apologise and say we didn't know. Every time something must be done. If people are being forced to pay this with tax, something has to be done.
I think it's a very fair point. A lot of people have been in touch on that as well. David has also been in touch on the business secretary's CV.
To become a solicitor, you have to do your law exams, your LLC, and then you have to do your articles. Once you've completed your articles, then you will become a solicitor and your name is published. If you're not, and then you're registered with the Law Society. If you're not, you're not. It's as simple as that. You can't be a trainee. That means you've not finished and you've never finished. The guy should be sacked.
David, thank you. Mac in Glasgow has an opinion on that as well. It says about Jonathan Reynolds claiming he was a solicitor when not qualified. This is highly illegal and he should face the full force of the law. Politicians need to be held to a higher standard. Keir Starmer needs to sack him for gross misconduct, especially as Starmer is a qualified lawyer and former director of public prosecutions. And doesn't he tell us that? Great show, says Mac from Glasgow. Stuart has been in touch and says everyone must watch We Will Dance Again, a documentary about the musical festival attacked by Hamas on the 7th of October. Stuart, I've watched it myself. It is a really superb documentary. It wasn't made by the BBC, but it was shown by the BBC on their iPlayer. And yeah, it's called We Will Dance Again. And we're criticising the BBC, but I mean, they put that on the iPlayer and good for them. It's a really, really tough watch. It's 90 minutes and you certainly don't want children anywhere near it. So just be very careful about that. But Stuart's advice is very, very good. Kevin in Southampton says the BBC have crossed the line many times over the last several years, but this latest one really hits hard and they need to be held to account and punished. I, for one, will stop paying their tax on me from today, says Kevin in Southampton. And Paul from Hertfordshire, just listen to Nicole Lampert there. I've cancelled my BBC licence. I won't pay for a company that supports terror. So I'm standing with Israel. Pete in Lincolnshire has been in touch about the story we're going to talk about now, which is about more teenagers on benefits for mental health than before the COVID lockdowns. And Pete says, great show. I wonder how many of the young people on benefits are from broken or migrant families. I expect probably quite a few, but there are, as we know, the statistics around this are really quite shocking. It's doubled the number of people who are on these benefits, and we have been talking about that today. this is the number of teenagers between 16 and 19 with mental or behavioural disorders has risen sharply. They get personal independence payment, which is £184.30 per week, and the figure receiving it is about 150,000. That's double what it was in December 2019 before the COVID lockdowns. Everyone says before COVID. Don't say before COVID lockdown. Before COVID, say before COVID lockdowns, because that is just more accurate. And it's the lockdowns, not COVID itself, that caused so many problems. COVID certainly caused many problems, but the lockdowns caused many problems as well, and they're separate but linked. Jamie Jenkins is a political and economic commentator and joins me now. Jamie, what do you make of this?
Yeah, good afternoon, Peter.
Good afternoon.
So it's no surprise when you hear this story, and you refer quite rightly there to it's not COVID, because the virus didn't cause this. It was the response to the pandemic. So I volunteer running a kind of a sports club, and the governments in Wales and obviously in England, Scotland, Northern Ireland as well. You know, it wasn't just schools that were closed over this period. They were banning sporting activities, which is well known for helping children with mental, to kind of get that activity. Exercise is good to reduce any mental health issues that you may kind of encounter. And when we look at the figures today, Peter, let's remember that we're talking kind of different cohorts of people. So obviously people who are 16 to 19 in the figures today would have been around 12 to 15 just around the time of the pandemic and the policies that were introduced. And then obviously the people who are 16 to 19, where these figures are doubled from, they didn't have those policies. So I think you can directly relate to the fact that the response to the pandemic, it was the closure of schools. And the important part, you've got to remember that when you're around 12 to 15, that's a really important part of your life, the social development.
And actually, one thing that someone pointed out to me that is just so important, and it's a really obvious point actually, but it wasn't one that I thought of, which is, when you're only 15, a year is a 15th of your life. Whereas, if you're 40 like me, that's a 40th of your life. So it's much less significant, and so much more happens. The difference between 14 and 16 is massively different than, the difference between 38 and 40. It is a hugely important time. You're developing, your brain is developing, your social interaction is developing. And we're seeing this not just with teenagers, but with younger children as well. And we're going to see so many more aspects of this happening and being part of the system and how the system is coping with people as time goes on, Jimmy.
No, you're right. And just to pick up on the 12 to 15-year-olds, they were then starting to move into that kind of age bracket where they're going more closer to adulthood. So they're in that 16 to 19-year-old age group. And it's important for that social development, as we've just touched on, because, when you're age 40, I'm age 45, you've had a lot of that social development. You've got lots more friends out there. You would have built those relationships up. But just locking people in, and I imagine a lot of these young children at the time of the pandemic, were just kind of in their bedrooms and isolated. I imagine there was a lot of online stuff going on, but we do know that, if you go back 10 or 20, 30 years ago, before the internet, people were outdoors a lot more. There was less electronics being used. So we probably pushed a lot of young people into kind of addiction with electronics as well. So that will probably be a part of it. And the important thing to remember here, they're going to get some support, but for some young people, this will be an impact, those policies over the COVID pandemic, it'll be an impact on the rest of their life.
Yes.
And that's the travesty here.
What can be done, do you think, now? Because it's so difficult to retrospectively deal with so many of these problems, especially when they've been developmental issues. And economically as well, we know that Liz Kendall, who is the Work and Pension Secretary, is trying to cut the benefits bill. She's trying to save £5 billion. I mean, if people being paid £184 a week, and even if there are 150,000 of them, that's not going to be a big part of the benefits bill. But it is taxpayers that are footing this, and there are hardworking people who are paying these bills as they should if people do have mental or behavioural disorders and can't work. I get that totally. But I just wonder how much, from an economist's point of view, Jamie, you think that there will actually be a bit of... I mean, I'm reluctant to say this as someone who actually myself suffers from mental health issues, as I've mentioned a few times on the radio. But, a bit of tough love, a bit of actually you should go to work because that helps you. If you can, should interact with as many people as you can because that helps your mental health. I just wonder how much of this will be economic, how much of this will be societal, how much of this will be that tough love I'm talking about, and how much of it should be.
Yeah, so what we really need to look into here a bit more is kind of how many of these people who are, is it easier to get this benefit now than it was, say, 6 years ago? But ultimately, this coincides with these massive waiting lists on the NHS. So how many of these young people are stuck in the NHS waiting list problem, where if you want to get them back into work, you know, they need probably that therapy to try and overcome the anxieties and the kind of the mental health issues that are being caused by the policies directly linked to the pandemic. And obviously we've introduced those policies. You can't go back and do that. We always say prevention's better than cure, but if they are not getting the support now, and I wouldn't be surprised if many of these people are getting this payment but are stuck there waiting for some treatment, and the government solutions have the money. So if you want to fix this, ultimately it comes back to getting the health service in position to do that. Or ultimately you want to go back one step before in the future, because I've got to learn from this, Peter. You know, if anything, God forbid, happens like this again, we shouldn't be locking the country down. We shouldn't be isolating children, because as I said just now, you know, a lifetime of harm for a couple of, you know, of years of policies that were completely irrational.
Jamie, thank you. That's Jamie Jenkins there, who's a political and economic commentator. Alan's been in touch from Manchester in this story, 0344 499 1000. Alan, what would you like to say on this? You're very welcome to the programme.
Hello, Peter.
Hi.
Just to say, I suffer from mental health issues myself. Last year I found my brother. He was passed away, and I found him in his flat. So 2 days later I was back at work. My son had cancer. We went through all that. I had a nervous breakdown, came through it, rebuilt my life. But this thing about mental health and kids today who are 19 and 20, I'm 50 years old, and my grandfather and my grandmother were born in 1917, 1916. They were born during the First World War. They then came through the Spanish flu, massive epidemic, killed millions. They then went through the Great Depression, one of the greatest depressions of all time. They then, at 19 and 20, fought a world war. Managed to bring a family up, managed to bring my parents up, managed to see us through, looked after us when we were kids, give us a bit of fortitude and to say, look, things are tough, but the nation needs to stand on its feet and say, look, we can't cry all the time. We can't say, oh, well, COVID, it was 5 years ago.
Well, you've been through this, Alan. You have been through, you know, you've just detailed there what you've been through, and I'm really glad you've given me a ring and you can talk so openly about it, and well done you for doing so. Where's the balance here, Alan? Where's the balance to say, you're going through something dreadful, we're going to give you some help, versus, or somewhere in the middle where someone says, actually, you know, we've got to get you back to work?
I think the underlying thing is that all governments for the last 25 to 30 years have taken away funding for mental hospitals, and I say mental hospitals, but institutions for people who are sick and ill, which has had a derogatory effect on police who are now serving time looking after people who are mentally ill. They've also downgraded mental health services and support services. Like, when I had my nervous breakdown, I had a team of people I could ring and support me. When now that's gone. There's no physical place you can go to apart from Samaritans and this kind of thing. The workshops are taken away. The actual staffing's taken away. So we're basically giving people money to be ill, but we're not fixing the problem by giving people...
So I mean, that's a really good point, Alan. And if, God forbid, and I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy, but if, God forbid, you were to have another nervous breakdown, would you be confident that that you would be dealt with and you would be helped in the way that you should be?
Well, like I said, it's 12 months since my brother passed away, and I found him in his flat, passed away. And I've been struggling for the past month, 2 months, whatever, but I've had a lady who's been fantastic, one of the counsellors, and I can talk about it now, but it's been dark days, and you've got to face it, and you've got to have that support, but you need the services to be there, rather than spend money on people who are genuinely ill, because that's the other side of it as well, Peter, that people who are genuinely ill and have problems can't get the support they need because the system's clogged up with people who, well, I'm not saying swinging the lead, but people who...
Well, there are some of them. There are some of them. There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
But if people toughened up and had somebody to talk to as a professional like I've had in the last couple of weeks, it does put a different spin on things. It does make things better. It does help. That's the fundamental problem we have in this country, is that we've not invested in the mental health services for people who are seriously ill and people who are borderline ill to support them back into work. That is the fundamental problem we have. And like I say, I do always think that, you know, you've got to have a bit of fortitude about you
and dig deep as well, Alan. You've got to dig deep sometimes and actually just try to get through things. And, you know, I've said it on the air. I've sometimes done programs where I haven't felt 100% or whatever, and people be very nice about it. But actually, when you really do go to work, show up, it can help. Sometimes sometimes you do need to take days off. That is something that needs to happen. And I think sometimes we can be a little bit reluctant to do so, because sometimes people don't want to take days off even when they should and need to and are perfectly entitled to when they are very unwell. But sometimes with mental health issues, sometimes showing up, sometimes going to work can help. It's something that Alan clearly has had severe problems. And Alan, thank you for sharing your story with us on a much smaller level. I'm not comparing myself to you at all, Alan. On a much smaller level, I can identify with many of the things that Alan talks about. I'm talking 1% of what Alan has been through. talk.tv/helplines is a really good resource for lots of different organisations that can help you if you've been through the kind of things Alan is talking about, or even what I'm talking about. And the Samaritans, of course, their number is 116-123. We're going to talk in just a second about the various crazy aspects of diplomacy, what Nigel Farage has said, what Donald Trump has said in regard to his Ukraine envoy. Keith Kellogg is meeting Zelensky in Kyiv amid this growing rift. Starmer backing Zelensky, and of course the continued coverage of what is happening in Gaza and Israel as well. Colonel James Sunderland will be with us in just a second. We'll take your calls, texts and tweets as well. Be sure to give me a ring, 0344 499 1000.
It is far too premature to be committing our troops. You know, I don't deal in hypotheticals when it comes to putting our people on the ground. We don't know what the terms of any peace deal will be. We don't even know if there will be a peace deal at this point. And imagine if it's a peace deal that actually gives Russia more territory than what they currently have, let alone the territory they're currently illegally holding. Are we really going to be willing to reinforce that, essentially suggesting that it's a just and fair peace? I'm really concerned because we know the Trump regime just want an end of fighting.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
Time now to find out how you could be in with a chance of winning £25,000.
It's competition time, and we're giving you a chance to win a whopping £25,000. So what do you need to do to get involved? All you have to do is text the word prize to 83338, or you can enter by post. It's as simple as that. Once again, to get involved, just text the word prize to 83338, or you can enter by post.
18 plus, UK excluding NI. Enter by SMS for £2 plus one standard network charge by 11 p.m. on March the 3rd, 2025. Or send your name, email and contact number to £25,000 cash competition, PO Box 3190, Colchester CO2 8GP, to arrive by 5 p.m. on March the 6th, 2025. This is a News Broadcasting Network promotion. Full terms and conditions at talksport.com.
Well, lots of people getting in touch on mental health, lots of people getting in touch on the BBC and Israel as well. We'll get into all of that and we'll make sure we take as many of your calls as possible. They're coming in thick and fast, 0344 499 1000. But just before I speak to you, I want to talk to the Colonel James Sunderland. He's a retired Army Colonel, former MP, former chairman of the Veterans grouping in Parliament. He was chairman of the Armed Forces Bill Select Committee. He knows military things fairly well. I think there's just so much that's happening. There is so much diplomacy. War, of course, is a form of diplomacy. And there are so many different things being said over the past few days. And I just want to sort of catch us up a little bit with what's happening with James. Nigel Farage has said that Zelensky's not a dictator. He has disagreed essentially with Donald Trump. He says that Donald Trump should be taken not exactly literally every single word, but should be taken seriously. We know that Keith Kellogg, who is the Ukraine envoy, is going to meet Zelensky in Kyiv. There is a serious rift here, and I wonder, as we sit here on Thursday afternoon at 23 minutes past 5, where do you see this, James? How do you see what is happening, and where do you think it goes?
I think that anybody listening to what's happening over the past 24 hours would rightly be concerned. And I'm quite concerned about it because this is potentially a huge rift. And in fact, strategically and geopolitically, this is probably more uncertainty right now than we've had for a long time. So what do I think? I think that the answer to the question lies in the extent to which Trump meant what he said. Was it rhetoric designed to bring a reaction? Or did he actually believe the words that came out of his mouth?
Yeah, it's a very, very good point. And I wonder, the thing a lot of people like about Donald Trump is, of course, that he's unfiltered. And the fact is that sometimes a filter might help in some ways, some people would argue. But in terms of Farage's role in this, and actually what Starmer does next week, he's going to be in Washington. How important is Keir Starmer in all of this? Does he really have any role to play? He says he wants to be a bridge, but actually, is anybody important apart from President Trump, President Putin, and perhaps to a lesser degree, President Zelensky?
Well, I think, first of all, what Trump said was actually wrong. So we know that the rhetoric is not based on fact at all, which is why Western leaders and others have been right to call it out today and to criticise Trump internationally for the comments that he made yesterday, which are clearly wrong. In terms of Keir Starmer, I'm the first to criticise Keir Starmer, but actually he's shown some leadership here. He is trying to put a coalition together. He is, I think, serious about putting UK boots on the ground as part of a coalition effort. And actually he needs a bit of support. And I dare say that Conservative shadow ministers right now aren't too far away in terms of their position as well. So let's give it a chance. Starmer's got work to do. He's going to have to speak to other European leaders. And of course, he's visiting Washington next week.
We all want peace in Ukraine. I wonder whether British boots on the ground as peacekeeping troops is a good idea. What do you think?
Well, it's usually a good idea if there's a clear UN mandate, there's a coalition effort, and of course, if you deploy into a situation that you know you can win. I mean, I think the history of British deployments over the last 20, 30 years, you'll recall the Blair-Chicago Doctrine from 1999. I mean, Blair, as a Labour Prime Minister, deployed more British troops anywhere than probably any Conservative Prime Minister.
Yeah, very good book about it called Blair's Wars by John Kampfner. It's a really good read. I just wonder, in regard to those boots on the ground, I mean, all of those things that you've talked about, those conditions essentially, we're very far from that, aren't we? I just wonder if you agree perhaps with Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, that we're perhaps getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, because we're in very, very early days of these negotiations.
Look, it is very early days. There's no mandate to do so. Ukraine and Russia are at war. Anybody going in there now will be entering a war zone. It is quite clear that Russia is no respect of international law at all. Would it respect the UN mandate? No. You look at the poisonings in the UK soil, you look at Crimea 2014, look at the patterns of behaviour in terms of their aircraft coming into British airspace, Russian ships down the channel. I mean, it is quite clear that Russia would have no intention whatsoever of honouring any agreement, particularly if British troops are on the ground.
I wonder if we can perhaps turn our attention a little bit to Gaza and the Middle East, James, because we know the BBC has apologised for using Hamas minister's son in the documentary. We also know that Isaac Herzog, who is the president of Israel, has said our hearts lie in tatters because the coffins of those 4 hostages, including a baby and a 4-year-old, have been returned to jubilation from Hamas supporters in Gaza. It's a really sickening spectacle. I just wonder what your assessment of what has happened today is, because there have been some pretty dark days in Israel's history, not least over the past 18 months, and particularly on the 7th of October. But today must rank amongst one of them. It's just absolutely grim.
I agree. Wherever you sit on that Hamas-Israel divide, that Israeli-Palestinian divide, I think what's happening is pretty grim. You've got Hamas vulgarity on your screen. I mean, these 4 family members were murdered in cold blood. No question about that. And to be parading those coffins in the way that they did is not human. My suspicion is that it will embolden Israel's resolve further to complete the job. I suspect that the job is not done in terms of what Israel wants to do, which is to eradicate Hamas and destroy Hamas in Gaza. I suspect that the fragile peace won't hold for too much longer, and I regret that we're going to see more bloodshed.
James, thank you. That is Colonel James Sunderland there, former MP, former colonel in the army. James Sunderland, lots to discuss on this, and particularly on the documentary. Lots of people have been in touch. Bernie in Hartlepool says there have been too many disgraceful occasions when the BBC have televised left-wing programmes and statements. This latest one should be the reason the government stops giving taxpayers money to this shameful organisation. Will someone please start a petition to defund the BBC, because the Labour and the Conservatives will not, unless the people of Great Britain show their disgust at this organisation, says Bernie in Hartlepool. Paul in Hertfordshire has told us he's cancelled his licence. David in the Cotswolds says the BBC did not show the Palestinian Party at the release of the bodies of the mother and her babies. I was sickened when the IRA murdered 2 soldiers making a wrong turn at a funeral in Northern Ireland. That was broadcast on BBC News. I am more sickened that the BBC do not show how Hamas terrorists act. Today has to be the end of the BBC. It is a propaganda channel, in the view of David in the Cotswolds. There's lots of a discussion about Ukraine as well. Ash of Haywood in Lancashire says, about Trump and Ukraine, we all need to calm down, for he is a showman as well as the greatest president to come along since World War II. He needs to be difficult, to act difficultly in selling the peace plan, so his delivery leads to his Nobel Peace Prize. Doesn't the Times and Starmer know this? Bill in Romsey says the leaders can say that Trump is out of order in Ukraine, but at least people are talking about peace. Bill, that's a really good point, actually. I just do think there are a lot of people who seem to fear peace. I mean, there has to be a just peace. It has to be done correctly. But nonetheless, Ukraine not being in a state of war is something I would welcome. And I'm just not sure a lot of people are in that place. It's very strange. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts. 0344 499 1000. We'll talk a lot more, particularly about Ukraine, about the BBC, and about Hamas, terrorists, and the TV licence as well. Lots to talk about. Give me a ring, 0344 499 1000. Stay with us here on Talk.
across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
Natalia has been in touch from Israel, and she says, "Hi Peter, today has been horrific, with many of us being unable to sleep last night, making the day feel like an actual nightmare. This is perhaps silly, but I'm pale-skinned like Shuri, and one of my daughters has bright red hair like Fear and Ariel, and while they were, of course, the entire nation's babies, they've certainly felt like mine. Jeremy Corbyn, the BBC and the like are an absolute disgrace, and to think I used to trust the BBC with the latest world news. Shame on them. We're heartbroken," says Natalia, "and to be honest with you, very, very angry. Thank you for your continuing coverage of this story." Angie says, "Very sombre mood today. Callers Jill and Scott are correct in what they say. It's a very nasty, insidious, psychopathic game Hamas are playing. What does the future look like for Israel and the innocent people of Gaza?" I wish I knew. I wish it was a bright future. Mohammed has been in touch from Oxford. He's given me a ring on 0344 499 1000. Mohammed, you're very welcome to the programme. What would you like to say?
Hi, good evening. How are you today?
Okay, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad, thank you. So I've been tuning in and out as I'm working, and you've had various interesting conversations, but I feel like we need to be a little bit more concise and hone in on the scope. And I'd like to talk about the Israel-Gaza hostage situation.
Go ahead.
Primarily. I don't know if it's... I don't necessarily want to sound like a... Well, first of all, actually, I think this seems absolutely disgraceful. I think they're horrendous. I think it's horrible that there's loss of any innocent lives. I believe I saw a video on social media at some point of the Beaver's family, and it was quite horrible. Something, it's very nasty. I don't know what Hamas aims to achieve out of that type of public display. But my point is actually regarding you guys in the media. I feel like when you don't take a position that has any kind of basis of neutrality in it, then you're only fueling this hateful vengeance rhetoric that is just going to probably carry on going on for centuries the same way it already has been. I feel like you'll just propagate that.
How would you be neutral in this one, Mohammed? Would you say on the what? On the what?
No, not on this. Not on this one. I feel like neutrality would be to also staunchly advocate against Israelis who protested for the right for them to commit rape on prisoners of war, for people that sign bombs that are being missiles that have rained on Gaza, for people celebrating in the streets at the death of Gazan children. I don't hear you talk about that with as much further as you do talking about this situation.
Where is the celebration? Where is this? Hold on a second, Mohammed. Where is the celebration that Gazan children have died? Where are the people celebrating?
Israelis on their balconies, knowing that the death toll is rising by the thousands. They're watching these missiles go in, and they're celebrating that. There's loads of videos. I can pull it up. I can send it to you on Twitter if you want. Like, it's all. Everyone knows that. Everyone listening to this right now knows that. We don't talk like this. There's a certain scope. I don't know if it's an internal bias or it's like
it's a very straightforward thing, Mohammed, in my mind. Maybe it isn't in yours, but it's horrible.
I
know, and you said that. You've said that absolutely, and I'm glad you've said that. But this isn't a straightforward. This isn't a on one side and on the other. I don't support. I don't want any Gazan child to die. I've talked about that. I don't want any innocent civilian to die. I agree with you. I will shed absolutely no tears if Hamas terrorists die, because they live by the sword and they die by the sword. I don't agree with every single thing the Israeli government does. I don't agree with every, Netanyahu I don't think is a particularly nice person. In fact, I think he's a very corrupt person. What I do see is that there's one culture that is pretty similar to our own, that allows freedom of speech, allows people to live relatively free lives. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it's very imperfect. And then I see Gaza, and Gaza is a place that I would not want to live, or not want anyone I know to live, because there's so many problems with it.
Okay, half of your statement had some fair points there, but the difference is that this situation of living in Gaza is a product of apartheid and an occupation and an ethnocratic...
Gaza hasn't been occupied since 2005.
No, that is not true. That is
It
not
hasn't
true.
been occupied. That is factually true. It is factually true that it has not been. It is. Mohammed, sorry, it is factually true that Gaza has not been occupied since 2005. That is.
So how come? There's the head of Mossad, the former head of Mossad, had said that we allowed cash to go into Gaza. They were allowed Qatari money.
That's not occupation.
You're allowing cash to go.
That's not occupation.
It is an occupation. How come things are prohibited, such as anything?
It's not an occupation. The point was. The peace deal was, the point was, Mohammed, as you know, let me just speak for a second. I promise I'll let you speak. I'm not going to cut you off.
I'm sorry.
Don't worry.
I didn't mean to be rude.
It's okay. We've both got strong feelings on this. But the point is, and I'll come back to you, I promise, because I want to hear what you have to say. The point is that in 2005, the Israelis pulled out. In 2006, there were elections. Hamas were elected. Some people say that was a free and fair election. Many people don't. And the Gaza Strip function. Now, within that time, from 2005 until the last couple of years, what did Hamas do? They invested in rockets, they invested in equipment and tunnels to wage war against the Israelis. They didn't feed their own people. They didn't build infrastructure for their own people. They didn't build roads. Gaza could be a lovely place, and it wasn't. And that's what Hamas did. And they want the propaganda victory of as many people dying as possible because they believe in martyrs. They're a horrendous organisation, as you have said. I totally accept that. But it's not. I mean, look, Israel have a role to play here. I've not saying that for a second. I haven't shied away from that. But Gaza factually has not been occupied since 2005.
There's a plethora of reasons for why I disagree with that, for why it's a de facto occupation, and for why there's reasons that would put Hamas in a position where they could take advantage of the situation, where they could, whether they rally people or they oppress other people or whatever it is. Like, the elections, they're a dubious thing. We know that around the world, right? We don't know how many people sympathize or even agree with what Hamas is doing. I don't think it's fair that all of these people are represented.
But also,
okay. Let me come back to you on a different point, right? Would you, the same way that you would describe what they do as terrorism and then being a terrorist organization where someone else might say they're a resistance group or whatnot,
they're a terrorist organization.
Fair enough, you're allowed to have that, to make that statement, right? Would you then say what Israel does is terrorism?
No, because it's a state. No, it's different. No, it's a state.
And also, state-sponsored warfare is not terrorism, but if it's not state-sponsored, is that what the difference is? That it's conducted by state.
There was peace.
To be democratic.
Okay. Couple of points. Factually, there was peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis it was actually remarked upon by the National Security Advisor at the time, a man called Jake Sullivan, who said this was one of the most peaceful times before the 7th of October. Then there was terrorism. Then Israel defended itself, and specifically on the point of civilians.
So
hold on a second.
International laws and ICJ and ICC.
I don't trust either of those institutions because there are various people who are judges on those who have absolutely no right to stand in judgment of anybody. They're from places like China. They're from places like North Korea. They are retrospectively.
And one of which these judges is a son of a Holocaust survivor. Are you aware of that? A Jewish person.
I mean that doesn't mean that the majority of the court believes them.
Just be fair. That's what I mean with neutrality. You'd mention the Chinese and the other people, but you're not mentioning this because this doesn't serve what you're trying to portray here.
Okay, well, let me just make a couple of points to you, Mohammed, and I promise I'll let you respond.
The thing is, why I actually haven't clocked out of work.
You got to go.
I have to go. I'm going to get to hold up in a minute.
Okay, well, just final point from me. Do you have time for a final point, Mohammed, or not?
Yeah, I do have time for a final point.
Okay, final point. I mean, there may be instances of Israeli civilians who celebrated Israeli missiles being fired into Gaza to target Hamas, but Israeli civilians did not invade Gaza. They did not rape, they did not burn, they did not murder, and they did not kidnap Palestinians. And it's not just Hamas. It's not just Hamas. It's not just Hamas terrorists either. There are civilians, Gazan civilians, who kidnapped Shiri and the Bibas children. There are Gazan civilians who beat and spat on Shani Luke's body as terrorists drove her around Gaza. That happened. There are civilians who did that.
I think that'd be a good debate about the fog of war and the result of occupation.
Well, those things are horrible. Those things are awful. Those things are dreadful, and they should never happen.
Yeah. I mean, you've made some I appreciate you more than LBC presenters that I've spoke to in the dialogue they were having. I'll give you that one.
All right, well, ring me back another time, Mohammed. I don't think clock out now. I don't think we're ever going to agree, but nonetheless, thank you very much indeed for speaking to me. That's Mohammed there, who is in Oxford, who's off to clock out. I'm not clocking out for another hour and 18 minutes because I'm still here with you, and Kevin O'Sullivan will be here between 7 and 10. Matthew in Newport has been waiting very patiently to talk about the BBC. Matthew, apologies for keeping you waiting, but tell me your thoughts.
Yeah, no problem. Just an aside, a quick aside. I did speak to you last night, and you said that you corrected Trump's thing about Zelensky and the 4% approval rating.
Yeah.
And I said how these things can become true, so they're spoken. That was read out today by a text given to Ian Collins and not challenged. So, I mean, I know it's someone's opinion, but someone was repeating exactly what Trump said as a truth.
Yeah, it does happen. There's no doubt about that. And we know that Zelensky's approval rating, most recent poll, asking people in Ukraine, how do you approve or disapprove of Zelensky? 57% approve of them.
Yeah, well, they say tell a lie often enough and it becomes a truth. Anyway, going back to, so today I listen to talk radio while I'm at home, and I'm retired, so I'm at home a lot. And I got in the car to go up to get something for the wife, and radio was on, and it started with a description of the Hamas terrorists. They didn't call them terrorists, I would say. They said the Hamas group, although they do normally refer to them as...
was this the BBC group. Or another organisation? Oh, no, this was Talk, was it?
No, it was another station. I'll tell you the station at the end. And they described the 1,700 people, whatever, were murdered, killed, held hostage. They were then saying that the bodies were being given back of these children, and they painted a picture, a brilliant picture, by saying, to this music. And it was obviously a fanfare music. It was almost celebratory. It was disgusting.
Yeah.
And it was spoken to, and they were speaking to Israeli people. They were putting it from an Israeli point of view, and it was painting a superb picture describing the boxes, and that was the BBC.
Interesting you should mention that. And I mean, Matthew, look, we're being harsh in the BBC. Well, maybe not harsh. I think we're being fair, probably, in regard to this documentary, which they screwed up. There's no doubt about it. They screwed up in this documentary. And listen, and we have talked about We Will Dance Again. I don't know if you've seen that documentary, Matthew. It's on the BBC iPlayer. I would highly recommend it. Make sure there are no children anywhere near you. Take your time and watch it. I mean, it was 90 minutes and it was a tough watch. But it does tell you what happened at the Nova Music Festival on the 7th of October. And listen, the BBC is not an entirely dreadful organisation. I listen to it, watch it every day because I have to. You know, I know quite a number because I've worked in journalism for a number of years. I used to work for the BBC myself. It's not an all bad organisation, but there are times when they do need to hold their hands up and say, we screwed up. And they didn't do that. It was dragged out of them. This apology was dragged out of them because of this documentary, Matthew.
I can't disagree, and it's infuriating because as a fan of the BBC, which I'll openly admit to because I listen to the radio a lot and I think it's worth it just for that, why they cannot double-check this and say, well, look, we are open to scrutiny. We have to be whiter than white, to use that phrase, and they've made fools of themselves again.
Yeah.
And it is just, and for me, it's like a real kick in the teeth. I want to defend them, and they go and do that, and you think, well, you know, how often, you know? So yes, but what I went to today, to say it was beautifully done is the wrong word because it was a disgusting event taking place, and they made that perfectly clear, and it's on the radio. I have to paint a picture.
Yeah.
And it absolutely got it across. And I don't want this constant, I'm not paying my fee because of this sort of thing. 50 pence a day, still a bargain, whether you like them or not.
Matthew, we have all sorts of viewpoints on this, and we appreciate yours. That's Matthew in Newport there. Christina in Spain has been in touch. She says, hi, Peter. You're doing great identifying as Jeremy. It was only a couple of weeks ago, Christina points out, the BBC played drill music by a vile convicted murderer. Yes, that was the murderer of Jimmy Mizzen. In fact, I spoke to Barry Mizzen the other day, who was Jimmy's father. I believe they threw someone under the bus on that occasion rather than accept responsibility. As for fabrications of CVs, only one word, says Chrissy: integrity. Malcolm in Hampshire says BBC documentary and apology would be an insult. Justin in Bradford on mental health. We've been talking talking about that as well this hour. Justin says, I'm the manager of a nightclub and we employ lots of young people. I find that those with mental health issues often thrive and their health improves with the work. The problem is with the government increases, we soon won't be able to take as many risks with new starters. Justin, very, very interesting to hear that. And in fact, we're going to talk about that particular aspect next. This is a third of small businesses. Maybe Justin's is one of them. Sounds as if it is. There is a plan, as we know, because of Rachel Reeves's budget. This is going to happen in about 6 weeks' time. Start of the new financial year, 6th of April. There is a plan to cut, many businesses plan to cut staff amid fears of Labour's overhaul of workers' rights, and we are going to talk to the Federation of Small Businesses about that in just a minute here on Talk One. Your view as well, 0344 499 1000.
It is far too premature to be committing our troops. You know, I don't deal in hypotheticals when it comes to putting our people on the ground. We don't know what the terms of any peace deal will be. We don't even know if there will be a peace deal at this point. And imagine if it's a peace deal that actually gives Russia more territory than what they currently have, let alone the territory they're currently illegally holding. Are we really going to be willing to reinforce that, essentially suggesting that it's a just and fair peace? I'm really concerned because we know the Trump regime just want an end of fighting.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well then, let's talk about the third of small businesses that plan to cut staff. This is after Rachel Reeves's budget. It was many weeks ago. In fact, it was at the very end of October, and still the reverberations are being felt because it will be on the 6th of April, the start of the new financial year, that all sorts of new taxes will come in, specifically in regard to national insurance. Small businesses make up the vast, vast majority of businesses in this country. We know that the average business isn't a multinational, isn't someone that has a business that has hundreds of different employees. The average business in this country has something like 7 employees. Okay, there are loads and loads of people probably doing jobs right now, probably have the radio on as they're plastering or doing a bit of plumbing or in the hairdressers or going around in their van. The people who are the absolute backbone of this country, who often work for small businesses or work for themselves. I had an electrician in my home today, works for himself, for example, and he is someone who could hypothetically be affected by this if he took on extra people, although if you have fewer than 4 employees, well, that is something that there have been some tax breaks about. Martin McTague is the national chairman of the Federation of Small Businesses. Martin, is this just a ticking time bomb for small businesses? Some of them will be okay at the end of it, but I'm sure there's a lot of worry.
Yeah, there is a lot of worry. I mean, we did the survey and I was staggered by the result. we had 92% came back and said they were worried about the Employment Rights Bill. And it's not difficult to see why. There are 28 pieces of new legislation built into that piece of legislation. And the biggest one, the one that concerns most people, is unfair dismissal on day one. You know, when you think of the kind of people you've just been describing, they don't have a complicated HR system. They have informal recruitment, and they're going to end up facing an industrial or an employment tribunal process, which frankly scares most of these people. And then if you pile on top of that the proposal that sick pay will be charged from day one, that also piles pressure on the costs that are involved in running a business that frankly make it very difficult to see how they can climb out of this. I mean, the latest results we're seeing is that 87% say they will be very cautious about employing new people. And as you said earlier, a third of the people surveyed are saying that they will actively consider getting rid of people before this legislation comes in.
Well, I've spoken to people on the air, you know, people who've rung in perhaps or left a voice note or whatever, and they're people who, you know, you will talk in a very scientific way to these people. You talk to them all the time. You're their voice as the Federation of Small Businesses. But there's so many people who've spoken to me, even anecdotally, saying, you know, I employ 10 people. We're not going to take we have apprentices we've taken on. They're coming on perhaps the end of their hairdressing apprenticeship, for example. I spoke to one hairdresser who told me, you know, these people are coming to the end of their hairdressing apprenticeship. We can't take them on. It's going to cost so much more in order to do so. And it's that hesitation that actually will be problematic, because the Labour government has bet the farm on growth. If the economy doesn't grow, their economic plans don't work. How can you get growth if the stranglehold is being put on small businesses? That would be my question, Martin.
Yeah, well, it's a fair question. When you think about the kind of people that are recruited by small businesses, they're often the people who are traditionally furthest from the labour force. That are people with poor employment records. They may have had a history of poor health. They are people who have been unemployed previously or had spells of unemployment. Lots of small business owners are prepared to take a chance on them now, and they're saying clearly to us they will not be doing that. And what that means is it damages the prospects for growth. And that's the central issue that the government has said that they want to try and tackle. Now, our view is if they scrap this plan for day one dismissal rights, and they also say that they'll revert back to where they were with the last Labour government, which is a one-year qualifying period, then we think that there is a serious chance that we can reverse most of the damage that this is causing.
Do you think that's realistically going to happen? I'm sure you're lobbying for it. You're talking to the Treasury all the time. You're talking to Jonathan Reynolds, the solicitor or trainee solicitor, whatever he is. He is, you know, those are people I'm sure the FSB, the Federation of Small Businesses, are talking to. But are they listening?
Well, they are listening, and this isn't going to be a quick process. We're talking about probably 2 years of debating these issues before we get to a formal position. Now, I think it's very important that small businesses up and down the country, and we are being the voice of those small businesses, make it absolutely clear to the government that their growth ambitions are incompatible with these plans.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. That's Martin McTague there. He's the National Chairman of the Federation of Small Businesses, joining me on Talk Drive. Thank you to Shan in Cardiff, who says, "Hi Peter, great show. I have seen the sad images of the coffins being returned today. Hamas couldn't even bring themselves to put those two babies in small coffins. They hid their horrors by using an adult-sized coffin for both those babies. What a sad day." Keith is in Surrey. Keith, just before we go to the news at 6 o'clock, I'd like to hear your opinion. What would you like to say, Keith?
Yeah, good evening.
Good evening.
Yeah, it's about October the 7th.
Uh-huh.
Now, Hamas went in there, right, and they attacked innocent women and children and men, and they did it unprovoked. Right? And I think one of the problems here that people are moaning about is that the reaction from the Israelis towards the Palestinians. Those Palestinians, Hamas, once they got back into their homeland, across the border, thought that they were perfectly safe. Now, they weren't. And they were followed in there by the Israelis, and the Israelis have done what they did. And I can fully understand why they did it. I think the problem is that they got there and they thought that they would be safe and they wouldn't be followed in there and dealt with. And that wasn't the case.
And very naive as well. I mean, if you carry out such horrendous attacks and murderous, barbarous attacks and take hostages, what do you expect the Israelis to do? And also, I would like to ask a number of people, not you, Keith, because I think we basically agree on this, but what do people expect the Israelis to do? Did they not expect them to defend themselves? Did they not expect them to take retaliatory action?
Peter, what would anybody expect anybody to do in a situation like that? Yeah. I mean, I think most like-minded people would want to do the same thing. They would want to retaliate. That's what happens. Well, I don't know.
No, it's an interesting point, Keith, and I thank you for it. That's Keith in Surrey there. Thank you to Keith in Durham, another Keith, who says on Saturday Israel will receive the final 6 living hostages. This will allow Israel to be in a position to finally eradicate Hamas once and for all. Well, Keith, we don't actually know how many of the remaining hostages, about 50 of them, are living. We know that they will get 6 more, that's right, on Saturday, but actually the position and the facts around that are just not known. There's lots of speculation, but of course Hamas terrorists aren't exactly forthcoming with the facts around them, and they've lied repeatedly, as well as many other things they shouldn't have done. Howard in Suffolk says, talkTV is more balanced than any other media outlet on the planet, says Howard. Well, I appreciate your thoughts on that. And Ben in Plymouth says, putting British troops into Ukraine is a bad idea. The last gasped attempt to have some say in the war. Starmer is a joke on the world stage. No one cares about him, not even his left-leaning Euro mates. Well, we're going to continue to talk about that with Candice Holsworth. She will be with us in just a few minutes after the news here on Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
Just on 6 o'clock, this is Talk Drive. I'm Peter Cardwell. Thank you so much for your company this Thursday evening. Lots to talk about today and indeed tomorrow. I'm back between 4 and 7 for Talk Drive tomorrow and at the weekend, but from 10 o'clock on Saturday and Sunday. Zelensky is not a dictator. That is what Nigel Farage says. Lots going on in regard to the diplomacy in and around Ukraine with Russia and those talks. We're talking about a number of other things as well. Israel, the horrendous scenes there with the return at long last and well overdue of those hostages, the bodies of those hostages, absolutely horrendous, murdered by Hamas. They say they weren't murdered by Hamas, but I mean, I know who I believe. A third of small businesses planning to cut staff amid fears of Labour's overhaul of workers' rights, and an asylum seeker declared a child by UK judges despite the fact he's 23 years old. He has a receding hairline and thick facial hair. This is the world we are living in here in the great United Kingdom. As always, I want your thoughts on all the topics that we're talking about today. We'll get Candace Holdsworth in a second, but I want yours too between now and 7 o'clock. Plenty of time to get as many calls, texts, tweets and WhatsApp voice messages on the air as possible. 0344 499 1000 is the number to call. You can text me 87222 with the word talk in your text. You can tweet me at talkTV. Follow me at Peter Cardwell. You can send me a voice note. You can send me a WhatsApp text message or give me a ring for a live discussion on the air. 0344 499 1000. Stay with us here on Talk Drive. We're also talking about Jonathan Reynolds. He is the business secretary and he has been sent a letter by the professional body of solicitors to say stop saying you're a solicitor, because he's not. He was a trainee solicitor, then he stopped being a trainee solicitor. He has never been a solicitor. Labour says, well, yeah, you know, maybe, no. He said it in Parliament on a number of occasions that he was a solicitor. He never, ever has been. Smudge in Swindon says, hi Cardi P. Definitely an interesting take today, news-wise. Reynolds, the fake solicitor, will fit in well with the other cabinet fakers. None of the integrity to see how it all looks, to both foreign governments and, most importantly, the British taxpayers who fund them. Had this lot been Tory, Labour would have been howling like wolves at the thought of their misdeeds. Hypocrites is being polite. Alison says on mental health issues, she says if the young people of today like being on benefits, then when they're older, they will regret it. I became sick and disabled when I was 31. I lost my career, my home and my life. I would swap my life now for any of those younger people. Life is not fun when you don't have one. Don't look back and wish you had done things. You have to live your life now. Alison, I'm sorry you're in that situation. I also thank you for your encouragement and optimism, which will be heard by many thousands of people, so thank you for that. Ben says, how many on benefits should be on benefits? I reckon it's at least 60% of them, and they certainly shouldn't be receiving support at the cost of taxpayers. Ben, I respectfully disagree. If people do need help, if they need support, and they're genuinely disabled, people like Alison, for example, I have no problem as a taxpayer with my taxes going to fund those people, because if you need it and you can't work and you are ill, well, that's okay, and that's what we do as a compassionate society. So, Ben, on this programme, as you know, we disagree without being disagreeable. I hope we've done that. Alison says, another Alison says, I don't agree with everything from Farage or JD Vance, but it's such a world apart. How can they just speak without reading off scraps of paper and answer a question head on? Unlike our current leader, it really grips me how unprofessional it comes across. And just a general one from Marty in Norfolk, who says, I've recently switched across from BBC to Talk. I'm so grateful for the honesty and free speech reporting. You're restoring my faith in news media. Well, that is very, very kind, Marty, and I will make sure that all of the team, both in front of the camera and behind, are aware of that. So thank you, and great to have you on board. Let's talk to Candace Holdsworth. She is a writer and broadcaster. So much around today that I want Candace's wise thoughts on. Perhaps we will start with that mental health question, actually, Candace, in regard to all these teenagers, double the number on something called personal independence payment than before the lockdowns. And we know that there has been so much harm to so many people that has happened in the last number of years. What's your reaction to this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I don't know if you're right, if it's more to do with the lockdown or if it's something to do with parenting styles, which we've discussed before, where children are very protected and they become a lot less resilient, I kind of feel like it's difficult to work out which one it is, because none of us went through something like that at their age.
Could it be both, Candice?
It's possible, but sometimes I think that we focus too much on how the individual's dealing with things, and sometimes we don't examine their circumstances enough. And I think that when you're going through a period of real growth and development at, say, the age of 17, 18, and suddenly you're locked in your house, you don't get to meet all the same milestones that many people meet at that age, it could have an inhibiting effect that maybe we don't understand very well. Maybe we need, what I would not say is that they should just be placed on benefits and left on the scrap heap. And I think that that's such an issue that people are just being signed off. Maybe we need to acknowledge the effect that lockdown had on that generation and find some way of helping them through it. Because like that text message you got from that lady, that was such wise news. They must think of 50-year-old them. How will 50-year-old them look back on the decisions that they made when they were in their 20s?
It's a very, very fair point. Should say the White House is having a press briefing at the moment. We will keep across that. I know that the producers behind the scenes are making sure that if anything comes out of that we need to bring you, we will tell you. That is just happening at the moment. It happens basically every day. But if there's news happening specifically in regard to Ukraine and what Donald Trump is doing, we know that he is meeting Emmanuel Macron and indeed Keir Starmer in the next few days or so. We know that Nigel Farage as well has made his views clear. A lot of people wondering what they were, and he says that Zelensky is not a dictator. He says that Donald Trump should be taken seriously, but not literally. What do you make of that, Candice?
Yeah, that's the famous line from the journalist Selena Zito. She said, Donald Trump's fans take him seriously, but not literally, but his opponents take him literally, but not seriously. What I would say is I just think that those comments were unacceptable. I mean, it's not what you expect from a US president, and it's not what he should be doing when going into a negotiation like this. I mean, I don't think that you can call yourself an honest broker if you've already tried to delegitimize one of the people who has serious interest in these negotiations.
Also, I mean, my point, I'm probably more with Trump than you are on this particular issue, but on that specific thing, I think, if Zelensky's a dictator, what's Putin? I mean, Putin's not exactly Mr. Democracy, is he?
No, he isn't. Look, I'm sure Zelensky is far from perfect. He's an imperfect person thrown into extraordinary circumstances and trying to survive. And I'm sure he's made questionable decisions along the way, like everybody does.
Well, there's a heck of a lot of corruption in Ukraine, which is very much not examined by many people who seem to believe that Zelensky is, the Messiah.
That's the thing. So we shouldn't be having a debate like that. You're so right. Like, I am all for just having a very sort of fact-based, evidence-based debate about Ukraine, Zelensky. I suppose what I don't like is when it all goes a bit adrift of common sense and facts, and it starts becoming a little bit conspiratorial. And, I think I have seen that amongst some who are skeptical of the Ukraine war, which is a completely legitimate position. But there are people who start getting that Zelensky is uniquely evil in some way. And, he's manipulative. And, you've seen some of that as well with some on the right who are very skeptical of the whole post-war liberal order. And then they start saying that Churchill was a baddie as well. Some of their positions on things, I just don't think are legitimate or right in any way. And I think that's why, Trump's position jarred even amongst people who support him, because it just doesn't seem quite right.
Yes, indeed. I think it's a very fair analysis of that. Let's bring it back to the UK, because we have heard today a story about an asylum seeker who has been declared a child by UK judges, despite the fact he is 23 years old. He has a receding hairline and thick facial hair. I mean, call me old-fashioned, but that sounds to me like, what's that word? Oh, yes, an adult.
Yeah. And sadly, this has been going on for a while. And I've said this before, but it represents a huge safeguarding risk. I mean, he was placed in children's accommodation.
Yeah. Well, for people in schools and on accommodation, as you say, it's a very motivating thing to say, well, actually, I'm a child, because then you get all sorts of privileges in the way that you're dealt with. But it's not true. And it is a massive safeguarding issue, as you say.
Yes, and I think what's going on now is we're sort of seeing a clash between what people think is human rights law, which has also become a little bit, not a little bit, quite a lot adrift of common sense. I mean, it's very important that people have access to lawyers. And, if people were trying to deny asylum seekers access to legal representation, I would disagree with that. But it's sometimes the broadest, most nonsensical interpretations of human rights law that apply to people that can't get criminals jailed, for instance, or that says 23-year-old was a child.
Let's talk about that in just a second. But particularly this Sudanese immigrant, he's had the decision that he's not a 16-year-old teenager overturned by immigration judges in a recent tribunal, and will therefore be considered a child on his asylum application. As you say, you personally have no problem with people getting some legal representation. Well, I agree with you to an extent, but also his own legal bills, specifically on whether he's a child or not, which he factually is not, have gone to over £30,000 of taxpayers' money. I mean, I'm sort of laughing, but it kind of beggars belief, doesn't it?
Well, this is what happens when you create a whole set of laws or a whole set of bureaucracies. Business and an industry will form around it, and people will use it, and they'll use the arguments to get out of things. And that's all perfectly legal. I think now people are starting to question it, and it's clear that it needs some reform. It's very clear that it needs reform. And, it's interesting that, for instance, when Kemi Badenoch criticized these decisions, judges hit back and said, don't question our impartiality.
Don't question the judges. We can't ever. I was told as a young journalist at the BBC, don't ever criticize a judge on air. And I just sort of thought, what? I mean, they're human too. They make mistakes, and it's perfectly legitimate, especially for Kemi Badenoch, who's the leader of the opposition, and the Prime Minister, who himself was the chief prosecutor of this country, to say, actually, judge whoever, you got it wrong. That's called free speech.
Yes, and there's a tension growing between, democratically elected politicians and the legal profession, especially over these issues of asylum seekers and immigration, where politicians don't feel that they can enact what they were elected to do, what the people want them to do, and they're sort of suffering the consequences of not being able to do it. And then there's judges who are making decisions outside of that, and there's a huge conflict brewing between it, and it's not easily reconciled, like things like, for instance, prisoners' voting rights was a number of years ago.
That was one of the things David Cameron actually did very well, where he said, actually, this is a ruling and we're going to completely ignore it. Let's talk about another legal issue, which is, you were hinting at a second ago. This is Hassan Abu Haleh. He's 39. He assaulted, in fact, he's a sex offender, a 19-year-old woman. He suffers from PTSD after being tortured, his lawyers say, and jailing him would be very dangerous. And he may have sexually assaulted a teenager, but putting him in prison would breach his human rights. He drove around at 3 o'clock in the morning looking for vulnerable, drunk women. He attacked someone 20 years his junior, a 19-year-old woman, and sexually assaulted her. He was due to be sentenced on Monday at Bournemouth Crown Court, but the hearing was adjourned after his defence barrister argued that sending him to prison might breach his human rights. Where do you even start with that, Candice?
Yeah, that's reason gone mad, isn't it? Technically he can offer that defence. It's obvious that it's there, but most people would disagree that that is not just. And, if you were to take human rights law out of it and he was just to be tried under ordinary circumstances, I'm not a lawyer, I'm just saying this as a layperson, how much would that be taken into account? What trumps what? And I think it's really good that people are starting to scrutinise these decisions now, because ultimately law has to be respected by the people, or it's not legitimate.
And there has to be the principle somewhere along the way that if you infringe someone else's human rights, such as that woman's complete right to walk along, I don't care how drunk she was, completely unharassed, completely free to go home, as so many people do after nights out. Instead, she was sexually assaulted by this absolute thug. What about her human rights? What about her trauma? What about her PTSD potentially after such an attack? And these things just aren't thought about in the same way. And there's so many people who feel, as I feel in this particular case, that the rights of the victim have been trumped by the rights of the perpetrator.
Oh, and they so are. And I think, we've only just started to understand exactly what victims go through. There's all the obvious things, but then they can become re-traumatized, for instance, when their attackers are released early. And I think that I think victim impact statements do try and get a hold of that. But no one should be able to claim that their PTSD in some way justifies them behaving violently like that against another person. That's just pure malevolent behavior. And I think things have gotten all topsy-turvy and upside down when that can be used as a justification for more lenient behavior, because it's not.
Candice, thanks for your analysis. Thanks for your thoughts there. That is Candice Holdsworth, who's a writer and broadcaster, giving us her thoughts on that. Thank you to Chris in Newbury, who says we should have some we should have some sympathy for Rachel Reeves. Can you imagine the state of her next CV? Chris, that's a very, very good point. As I have a glass of water, I'm going to tell you now about how you can be in with a chance of winning £25,000.
It's competition time, and we're giving you a chance to win a whopping £25,000. So what do you need to do to get involved? All you have to do is text the word prize to 83338, or you can enter by post. It's as simple as that. Once again, to get involved, just text the word prize to 83338, or you can enter by post.
18 plus, UK excluding NI. Enter by SMS for £2 plus one standard network charge by 11 p.m. on March the 3rd, 2025. Or send your name, email and contact number to £25,000 cash competition, PO Box 3190, Colchester CO2 8GP, to arrive by 5 p.m. on March the 6th, 2025. This is a News Broadcasting Network promotion. Full terms and conditions at talksport.com.
Well, I've got some really shocking, really surprising news to bring you after in the next couple of minutes. And that is that left-wing activists are apparently less likely to work with their political rivals than other UK groups. They've got groupthink, they think they know better than other people, and they don't want to work with other people or listen to their opinions. Shocker. Front page of The Guardian today, no doubt. The granola was dropped all over the front page in Islington. We will get to the bottom of this in just a minute here on Talk.
Russian army can do nothing with Ukrainians, despite they're bigger than we, despite that they have more weapons, and so on, so on. They can do nothing. They have lost minimum 300,000 people being killed in Ukraine. Can you imagine? 300,000 killed, not less than 600,000 injured. That's absolutely dramatic losses for Russia, but they don't want to stop because they don't care about their losses. And yes, now they will put all their energy inside Ukraine, try to destroy Ukraine from inside.
Across the UK. On DAB+. On YouTube. On your mobile. And on your side. This is Talk.
I've just been reading the Guardian newspaper in the break. Yes, really, your radio or TV has not gone wrong. I actually do read the Guardian every now and again just to find out what the lefties are up to. I will tell you why in just a second, but first of all I want to read out what Graham from Bushy has said. With so many changes being made to Labour MPs' CVs, maybe I should buy shares in Tipex. Tipex, Graham, that takes me back. Nikki sent a voice note on the BBC.
Yes, I think that the BBC did screw up with this documentary, but it seems that the knives are out permanently for the BBC. I enjoy radio very much. I listen to a lot of stations, and I do enjoy what they do on the BBC. It's fabulous. I think if it was ever got rid of, we'd be poor as a country.
I kind of agree with you, Nikki. I'm not going to cancel my licence fee. I need the BBC to do my job. I can't do my job without the BBC. I do like quite a lot of Radio 4. I do listen to some of it. I listen to regional stations, including Northern Ireland stations on the BBC, BBC Radio Ulster. You know, it's not all bad. It's not all bad or all good, but clearly with this particular issue, they have screwed up. I also love Last Word on Radio 4. It's a great programme, obituaries programme by all sorts of people. You know, it'll go from a sort of Russian ballerina to, you know, a warlord. It's fascinating. Mark has got in touch on small businesses.
Yes, my business, I'm still paying off the CBILS loan that we took during the pandemic to get our business through. That finishes next year, and we've paid off quite a lot of money over that period of time. In respect to growth, which she's mentioning, forget about it. It's just stagnant. You never know from one month to the next where you're at. There's no growth. And ultimately, this national insurance increase for me with high-earning specialist staff, of which there's 11 of them, there's, you know, it's going to be a nightmare. So anyway, yeah, I've got no confidence in these people at all.
Very interesting to hear from Mark. There are clearly very difficult conditions that sound as if they're going to get more difficult. So Mark, thanks for that insight. I appreciate that. You can send a voice note in, same way as you send a voice note to anybody else, via WhatsApp, 0344 499 1000. I send a lot of voice notes, and they're just really good way to communicate, and it's great to get them on the air and get as many on the air. And there's some people who perhaps wouldn't want to ring and have a live conversation, although I love that, and we'll do a lot more of that between now and 7. But yeah, keep them to less than a minute. Send them in, 0344 499 1000. Now then, why am I reading The Guardian? Well, there's a fascinating headline. It may not come as a huge shock to you. It didn't come as a huge shock to me, but very interesting that it's being reported. And that is that the liberal left is apparently out of step with the rest of Britain. Left-wing activists in Britain are less likely to work with their political opponents than other groups, and more likely to think those holding different views have been misled, a study has found. Yeah, it's you know, most of the left think the right are completely wrong, obviously, and have been misled, very interestingly. Maybe not most, but some anyway. The study by the polling group More in Common finds that about 8 to 10% of the population, whom they classify under the heading progressive activists, hold strikingly different views on a range of issues from the rest of Britain. The group is more likely to dislike and criticise those that disagree with them than other voting blocs, a trait the report's authors argue has contributed to the repeated failure of progressive campaigns and the rise of the global far right. Well, let's talk now to someone who's behind this piece of research. This is Ed Hodgson, who's Associate Director of Polling and Analysis at More in Common. He's co-author of the report. Ed, thank you for joining us today. Why are the lefties just so completely wrong about everything?
I'm not sure I'd put it like that, but it is definitely true.
I'm being facetious, Ed.
Okay.
Except they are.
Well, I'm a pollster, so I can't necessarily take a view on...
You have no opinion on anything.
Wrong, yes. But I can say that their views on many issues, particularly cultural and social issues, really are quite different from the rest of the country. So they are the only group in the country, and we've divided the country into 7 of these groups. They're the only one who think that Just Stop Oil are more of a force for good than a force for bad. They're the only group who say that woke culture has had a positive impact on society. In fact, they're 5 times more likely to say it's had a positive impact on society than any other group. And they're also the only group where the majority say we should keep immigration levels where they are, or even bring them higher.
And I also think it was really interesting looking at what they think the other kind of proportions are in these things. Progressive activists, on average, believe that 35% of the British public agree with abolishing the monarchy, when the real figure is 18%. They thought a quarter of people would agree with letting more refugees into the country, 25%, when the actual figure is 8%. So not only are they isolated within their own political thinking, they're also thinking that other people think things that they certainly don't think. I mean, it's very interesting. You define these people as young, highly educated and socially left-wing. About 8% of the population, but it's far more represented in certain sectors, such as public sector bodies and charities. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the overestimation point that you raise is a really big one. If these people, they go out and campaigning, and a lot of them are very passionate about campaigning on the issues they care about, but they're assuming that 2 to 3 times as many of the public believe what they care about or the issues they're campaigning on than actually do. And the impact that has is that they're less bothered or less interest in trying to persuade people, and they think there's a sort of some imaginary base they can activate. So they go for protest techniques like blocking roads or really disruptive things like you've seen throwing soup on paintings, because they think there's a big body of the public out there who agree with their views. Whereas actually what they should be doing is listening to people, and if they want to campaign more effectively on the issues they care about, they should be making space for debate rather than trying to shut down debate. We also find that they're actually the only segment who say we shouldn't make space for debate on issues that they see as too harmful, and they should be listening to people rather than dismissing their views as sort of racist or informed by misinformation, and trying to understand where people are coming from when they make opposing arguments.
Listening and persuading, it'll never catch on. Why do they think they're so right? What is the kind of this sort of moral fibre, this sort of idea that they think, right, how could anybody not want to save the planet by gluing yourself to the road?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and there's lots of things to it. One might be sort of the social media echo chambers that many of them live in. So this is a group of people who are much more politically engaged than any of the other 6 groups we've identified. So about 56% of them say they've posted about politics on social media in the last year, and for the rest of the country, it's just 15%. And actually, one of the things that's really interesting about this group is they're not just different in terms of their views, but also they're pretty weird compared to the rest of the country just in like how political they are. So they're the only group really who say their political views are very important to their identity, much more so than things like where they come from or their nationality. They say their political views are more important, which means they see the world much more through sort of tribal groups according to their political views, and they see sort of in and out groups and the opposing side as being wrong and sort of something that needs to be challenged rather than sort of any shared identity with them.
Just briefly, can you outline what the other 6 groups are? Just briefly, if you wouldn't mind.
And I won't sort of go through all of them, but you can imagine some of them. So sort of, I guess, the mirror image of progressive activists, you have backbone conservatives. This is a group who have the most sort of conservative views, a backbone of support for the Conservative Party. But they actually agree with progressive activists on some things. So it's not like they're all completely opposed. So if you talk about conserving nature, progressive activists and backbone conservatives are aligned. You also have loyal nationals who are sort of like a red wall group. They voted for Brexit in the strongest numbers, for example. And loyal nationals, they're very socially conservative, completely opposed to progressive activists in that regard. But actually, if you talk to them about the economy, they're much more in favour of things like big taxes and regulations on big business. And on the economy, progressive activists and loyal nationals are quite aligned.
Very interesting. So, I mean, these clearly don't fit into the political boxes that there are. You're talking about conservatives and big support for the Conservative Party, but there are a lot of people who support all sorts of different political parties who actually believe very, very different things, and every party, as we know, is a form of coalition by itself. I wonder, with this research that you've put out, which I find absolutely fascinating, by the way, I think I'm going to go and read some of it in more depth after this programme. I just wonder what lessons we can learn from this, and will people who don't listen to other people suddenly start listening to them because they've been identified and you've done this research that can actually say, hold on a second, maybe listen and persuade rather than shout and glue?
Yeah, I mean, there will be some people who read this report and say, this is completely ridiculous, I'm not going to change my ways. But I do hope that some of the more sort of sensible people reading the report will stop and reflect. And I don't know, there's a tendency among sort of this progressive activist group to look at why their campaigns are failing and just blame it on, they would say, the far right or the right-wing media. Whereas sometimes there's more need for self-reflection and say, what could they be doing better to make their campaigning not necessarily more effective, but at least more empathetic and less divisive. And they can take some simple steps in sort of building broader coalitions, welcoming in more people to their campaign, rather than having sort of very strict rules on who is and who isn't part of their in-group, basically. They can use more inclusive language that doesn't sort of pit people against each other. And they can take all of these measures that sort of make their campaigning much more effective and much more interested in persuading people, rather than just sort of appealing to each other's views on what's right and wrong.
Or do what we do every single day here at Talk, which is start with the audience and work your way backwards. Which is not a bad plan for broadcasting. It generally means you're in touch with your viewers and listeners when you actually listen to them and give them what they want and lead them in that sort of direction, which we try to do here at Talk. Ed Hodgson, thank you very much. Really interesting to talk to you. He's Associate Director of Polling and Analysis at More in Common. He's co-author of The Report. So lots to think about then. And who'd have thought that the Liberal left would be out of step with the rest of the UK on woke culture and migration? I for one, am shocked, I tell you. But very interesting that this polling has been done and we know it now. Is as the polling suggests, it's true. In just a second, we're going to continue talking about Israel, because the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog, has said our hearts lie in tatters. Coffins containing the remains of 4 hostages, including 2 children, one who was 4, one who was just 9 months old, are returned from Gaza from Hamas terrorists who have been celebrating that fact. We're also reflecting on the BBC, because they finally now apologised after a number of days for using a Hamas minister's son in a documentary and saying, oh yes, we're just getting the views of ordinary Gazans. Are you? No, you're not. Sahil Ahmed is going to be with us. He's a former Islamist and he's now a counter-extremism practitioner. We're going to talk to him in just a second here on Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
I don't know about you, but I often hear stories on the news, often horrible things that happen, and you forget about them. You move on with your day, you hear a bit of it on the news, or you hear a little bit of it, snatch of it on the radio or the TV or whatever. But actually, the 7th of October 2023 is one of those huge, horrendous events that really did affect me, and it changed my views, really changed my views a lot on the Middle East. And the thing is that it's such a huge, massive thing, and what has happened in the last nearly 18 months has been so awful for so many people in Israel and in Gaza that we sometimes forget the human stories that are there. So I just want to tell you about one family. It's the Bibas family. Shiri Bibas and her 2 young sons, Ariel and Kfir, who were then 4 and 9 months old. 4 years old, 9 months old. Were taken hostage during the October the 7th Hamas terrorist attacks in 2023. We can see some footage of them on the screen now, if you're watching. The father, Yarden Bibas, he was abducted separately from his wife and children. Now, Shiri Bibas, the wife, and her 2 young sons, Ariel and Kfir, were murdered whilst in captivity. Hamas claim that the 3 Bibas family members were killed by an Israeli strike more than a year ago. This has not been independently verified, and Israel says it will not confirm their deaths before forensic testing. So that's going on at the moment. The fact is they were in Gaza and shouldn't have been in Gaza, and they were taken hostage by Hamas. We'll wait and see what the full facts are, but I know what my strong suspicion is, that Hamas terrorists killed him, as they have killed many other hostages. Yarden Bibas, the father, he was released alive on the 1st of February, so just about not even 3 weeks ago, along with 2 other hostages. Now, Sherry's parents, his wife's parents, Jose Luis and his wife Margaret, were also murdered by terrorists, by Hamas terrorists, on the 7th of October. It just doesn't bear thinking about what one family has been through, never mind the over 100 hostage families. And today, what happened was that the bodies of the 2 young boys and a few others were brought back to Israel. And we know that Hamas terrorists finally gave up those bodies. It's just awful, and it's Israel's saddest day. The president says, Isaac Herzog says, our hearts lie in tatters as those coffins, Shiri Bibas, her son Ariel, and baby Kfir are returned from Gaza, along with the remains of another hostage as well. I just want to talk to Sahil Ahmed about this, who is a former Islamist and now a counter-extremism practitioner. Sahil, what do you make of this as someone who has come from your background, seen the light, changed your ways, and now a counter-extremism practitioner? Because the kind of celebration, essentially, the carnival atmosphere that was in Gaza as these coffins were paraded, as people brought their children to see this as if it was some sort of festival, that has, to me, is almost cult-like. Maybe it is cult-like.
No, it is a cult. I can confirm that. It's not cult-like. It's the death cult. The people we are dealing with are frankly barbarians. They're savages. And I don't use that in a racial sense. I just use that in an ideological, cognitive kind of sense, in terms of their belief system. And they paraded the dead bodies in coffins of little children, paraded them like war trophies. Who on earth does that? You have to be so ideologically brainwashed. You have to have dehumanized the other, right? In this case, Jewish people, non-Muslims. You have to have dehumanized them to such an extent that you're willing to engage in, frankly, just barbarity.
And I wonder, in your former life, before you turned your back on Islamism, would you have felt the same way as those people? And why? You're talking about brainwashing. How did you get to that stage?
Honestly, I'll be frank with you. Even I, at my most radical, even when I was considering even engaging in violence, I wouldn't have paraded the dead bodies of children. I certainly wouldn't have even targeted children. And maybe that's the reason why I de-radicalized in the end, because I guess there was something still there for my humanity. But I know many of these people. I come from them, to so to speak. And the way in which they would speak of people, of humans, is just frankly something else.
Where do you stand on what Israel has done? Because it's really interesting that we've had a number of different perspectives, including from a caller called Mohammed in Oxford earlier, who questioned what Israel has done. Now, none of us want any innocent civilian in Gaza or in Israel to die or to have any attacks on them. But what would not responding actually have done? It would be my question, and I wonder what you think of this, Sahil.
Let's be frank. Hamas is ultimately responsible for what's happened. Hamas had the option of not engaging in the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. They had the option of not raping people, of burning people alive. They had the option of not engaging in taking hostage little children. They did. And they knew full well what happened as a result of that. They do not care for Palestinians. I know from first-hand accounts where I've spoken to Gazans, and the things I've heard I could not repeat on TV. They are frankly vicious individuals, and they do not care for human life, not even they don't even care about the human life when it comes to their own people. Now, Israel not responded. It would have just invited them to do worse.
So we're slightly having trouble hearing you, Sahil, but your points that you're making are very, very good ones. I think we've probably just got to end the interview there. I will have you on another occasion, but just the line isn't so good. So apologies for that. But what Sahil was saying there, as a former Islamist, now counter-extremism practitioner, someone who's turned his back on that, and he's never broken the law or done anything that he shouldn't have done legally. Otherwise, of course, we wouldn't have him on the station. But I mean, there is just so much there in what he says, and it's very powerful, I think, coming from someone with his background and his previous, not current, previous thoughts. So that is Sahil Ahmed there. Thank you to him. Thanks to everybody who's been in touch. We're going to take a load of calls between now and 7 o'clock. Kevin O'Sullivan's coming up between 7 and 10. I'll be back tomorrow between 4 and 7 for Drive. And remember, I'm back at the weekend as well from 10 o'clock on Saturday and Sunday. But in the next 17 minutes, we're going to get as many calls on the air about as many topics as we can. And for that, I hope you will pick up the phone and let me know your thoughts. So 344 499 1000. We'll have all those calls and texts and tweets and voice notes and whatever else you want to send us between now and 7 o'clock here on Talk.
It is ridiculous for any democratic politicians or even citizens to discuss any words of Vladimir Putin about democracy and elections. Vladimir Zelensky is a legitimate president of Ukraine. Myself is a legitimate member of the parliament of Ukraine. We have 1 million people in the Ukrainian army. We have 7 million internal replaced persons. We have not less than 5 million adults in Europe. How you can conduct elections, meaning democratic elections?
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
Michael is in Sunderland and has given me a ring on 0344 499 1000. Michael, you're very welcome to the programme. What would you like to say?
Yeah, thanks for taking the phone call. Just about, it's getting out of hand now about how biased the BBC is. I purposely, because I have the radio on and I was thinking about the channels, and the BBC, it was about the fourth item on their news item about the mass and the unfortunate deaths and the coffins about the Israelis.
Yes.
They didn't even show that spectacle of the coffins on the stage and everything. It just showed about 30 seconds of the coffin being put into the back of the car. Then, on the main news on BBC One, they then started going about Gaza, about all of the deaths that the Israelis have done in Gaza.
Yeah, a lot of people, and it includes. I mean, I've been reading tweets from the Taoiseach in Ireland today, as well, the Irish Prime Minister, who's been saying things like, we need to talk about the deaths in Gaza. Well, we do, and I'm happy to. But today, really, maybe we can just look at one thing and say that's bad and shouldn't happen, rather than having to say, but what the other side did, also not good, as if there's some sort of moral equivalence between the two of them, Michael. It's very concerning. I mean, do you trust the BBC to tell you the full truth about what's happening in the Middle East?
No, I don't trust about anything. To be truthful, like I say, is I have, like everybody, multiple news channels and this, like that. I listen to you, and I listen to the on the radio. I put the Radio Times on, a Times radio as well.
Yeah.
I listen to loads of different news outlets. But the BBC, and I'm thinking, I'm going to contact my son because I don't know if to start these boycotts up. I think I'm 60 years old. I think people should start not paying refusing to pay the TV licenses until they start providing the service that we're paying for. Now, I wouldn't go to a restaurant and pay for food if it's rubbish.
Well, I can't advocate breaking the law, but I know that a lot of people have decided not to access BBC services and have then decided not to pay their licence fee. So it's one option anyway. I will continue to pay my licence fee, and I'll continue to access the BBC because I can't really do my job without it. Michael, thank you. That's Michael in Sunderland there. Lisha in London. Hello.
Hi, Peter. Nice show. I actually watched that programme that you're talking about. I don't know if any other callers have called in saying that, but I actually watched it because I'd heard about this, the fact that they hadn't been honest or truthful about who the young lad was.
Okay.
But when I watched it, I thought I'll sit through about 5 minutes just so you know I'm Jewish and I'm very pro-Israel. I'm a Zionist, and I'm very, all of that.
Okay,
but I thought I'd sit through about 5 minutes of this and just see what it's like. And actually, it was not a bad show, and it did. I'm pretty sure Hamas did not have very much to do with it because there were call-outs by people who were sort of fleeing their homes, saying, basically, damn Hamas. And there was also comments by one of the kids, not the kid we're talking about, but one of the other kids, who actually said, I really wish we hadn't taken the hostages. And another person said something about the fact that they didn't, if they know now what would happen, they wouldn't have celebrated on the 7th of October.
Okay.
I mean, so, up to then, I thought, definitely most Palestinians in Gaza are, pretty pro-Hamas, but I'm not so sure. And I think
it's interesting when you look at some of the. It's hard to poll people. It's hard to get surveys, but there's some people saying only 30% of people in Gaza actually support Hamas. It's a tricky one, but I mean, I will watch it. I'll probably watch it at the weekend, but. At the same time, I'd just like all the facts to be out there, and with the BBC, I'd like them just to tell the truth and to stop prevaricating and stop changing their mind on these press statements, Lisha.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the BBC, and if I could give my licence fee up, I would. But I like you, I do want to see all views of the news. But I just think they are completely misspending our licence money.
I read The Guardian today, Lisha. I read The Guardian, so we all have to make sacrifices. Lisha, thank you very much indeed. Lisha from London there. Thanks for giving us a call. 0344 499 1000. Laura Jane is in Hampshire. Very good to talk to you. What would you like to say, Laura Jane?
Well, it came up this morning with Mike, and I tried to get through and couldn't, but it ties into what you've been discussing in terms of the Islamist gentleman who is no longer in. But I am a Roman Catholic. Obviously, I live in what is supposed to be a Christian country. The head of the church is the king. I worry about the blasphemy laws. I really am scared. I have 3 grown-up children who live in London. Obviously, I live in the countryside. When I go to Mass, I'm lucky. It's in a small village, but I do worry these blasphemy laws are coming in. They're going to be much more
restrictive.
very much well, and I'm worried you won't be able to say anything about your own religion. If you were living in the centre of London, and the community is much more varied, and you happen to be talking in the pub about, I don't know, the Pope or your beliefs, or maybe your beliefs on abortion, you might be having a discussion. I worry that I'm going to be arrested and told that and put in the jail because of my views. And my views are as a Roman Catholic, I have certain views. I don't agree with everything that the Church tells me. But, I'm worried. I'm very worried.
And I think a lot of people are, Laura Jane, and that's why we need free speech in this country. We need to find a better way to disagree with one another rather than slapping laws on things all the time. And blasphemy laws are... it's really interesting. Someone contacted me recently about someone burning the Quran and said, look, it's not something I would do. It's not something I would go out and do, but it's not illegal to do it. It's not illegal to burn a Bible. No. It's not illegal to... You, presumably, as a Roman Catholic, would find that highly offensive if someone did that. But it's not illegal, and we need to... and that is part of free speech as well.
But I mean, if you think about, Christianity and Islam throughout the ages, we know the Crusades were a horrendous time for Christians and Islam, but it's going on now, effectively, modern-day crusaders, and it's history repeating itself, or Queen Elizabeth chopping my head off because I'm a Roman Catholic. And
well, we don't want that.
Goes on.
We don't want that. I want your head to stay firmly attached to your body, Laura Jane, for many years to come. Thank you very much, Laura Jane in Hampshire there. Jason in Luton has an interesting thought here, which I'm going to take away and have a little think about. He says, if you can't do your job without being able to watch the BBC when required, then I'd claim it as a legitimate business expense, says Jason. Interesting. That is, I'm going to take that away and think about it. Helen has been in touch from Leicestershire. Helen, you're very welcome to the programme. What would you like to say?
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Helen.
Thank you. Great show, as always.
Thank you.
I just wanted to run past you the idea, which seems to me, thinking about all these very, very weird legal decisions that are being made, especially about whether or not we can deport criminals and so on. And it seems to me that we had all those years of being in the EU, and we blame the EU for all sorts of things we couldn't do. And now it seems to me that we've sort of contracted out all the decisions to the judges.
Yeah, well, we've always been...
We can't do this because of the judges, and it's, I just wonder what you thought about that.
Well, it's interesting because we part of things like the European Convention on Human Rights far longer than the European Union or European Coal and Steel Community and all. That's been a longer thing. And I suppose what we're now finding is actually it wasn't just about the EU. There were actually lots of other things as well that people perhaps weren't aware of before, weren't aware of those kind of frameworks. I mean, do you think we should withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, Helen?
That's a very, very good question, because obviously it protects some of my rights as well and your rights. But yes, I think really all these supranational bodies that were sort of put in place after the war, the Second World War, the UN and all of them need revisiting in light of the modern world.
And maybe a British Bill of Rights is the way forward in that as well, and that's something that has been mooted for a long time.
Yeah, I think the answer to your question is probably, this is off the top of my head, having not thought it through carefully, Peter, but we have to find a way of being responsible for our own decisions in our own country.
Yeah.
So whatever mechanism we could put in place, but to do that, the politicians have got to take responsibility. They've got to be grown up enough to be able to stop contracting out these decisions to other parties. That's what I feel about it. Yeah.
Thanks, Helen. Much appreciated. Helen in Leicestershire there. David in Eastbourne. David, I think you're a new caller.
I am. Mr. Cardwell, thank you for taking my call. I want to say to you why I think there's an anti-Semitic strain in Ireland. I'm first-generation English.
Okay.
I'm 73. My parents came from County Mayo and wanted for nothing. And we're devout Roman Catholics, and I am today. But my brother was going out with a Jewish person, a girl, when we were in our 20s.
Yeah.
And I was visiting home, and my mother just said to me, David, a Catholic can't have a baby with a Jew. And I said, Mum, why on earth not? Who told you that? And she said to me, back home in Ireland, we were taught it. A Catholic can't have a baby with a Jew because they crucified our Lord.
Oh, for goodness sake. Oh.
And I said, Mum, and I love my mother.
Yeah.
I said, Mum. And that brought to me then so much. Parts of Germany are very Catholic.
Well,
and when those carriages were rolling across Catholic Germany, they knew where they were going to. And they knew who was with them.
I think...
They would have... But there's one other thing. I used to read The Guardian when I was in my 20s, and I'm now in 73. And I remember when I was in my 20s, I was reading The Guardian. I used to get it every day. I don't touch it now. And the Irish Army provided soldiers for the United Nations north of Israel with Syria or Lebanon. And this Jewish Israeli army officer was said, I think he said, I don't know why, but we don't get on with the Irish soldiers when they come here. And I think it's part of...
Well, I wonder, certainly there are historical aspects to this, David. There's an article I wrote actually for the Jewish News about why there is so much anti-Semitism in Ireland, and maybe you'd like to take a look at that. And we remember, of course, that historically and factually it was the Romans who crucified Jesus, not the Jews, of which Jesus was one. He was a Jew. Anyway, Kevin O'Sullivan.
Bloody Romans. I'll tell you, we need reparations. Slavery. They were slave drivers. Where's the reparations?
Speaking of messiahs, here's Kevin is on between 7 and 10. What's on your programme?
Obviously, we're going to talk about Trump, Starmer, Ukraine. I mean, everybody getting their knickers in a twist about Trump. I get it. I mean, he went over the top in what he said about Zelensky and Ukraine. But these are very early days, you know. Read the
They're all rushing to react very quickly to things that haven't happened yet.
You know what Donald Trump's like? He'll say something right over the top and then compromise.